All right, looks like we are live for this epic show. Guys, looks like we've already got a great chat. We have an awesome panel here. We've got brothers George Bond, Mattman, and Professor David McQueen. Gentlemen, thank you for being here for this important show.
You're welcome.
So as you know, we've got a ton of stuff to cover in this stream. I'm sure a few hours are going to fly by. As you can see by the title, it's Endgame for the heat problem. So guys, we have a ton of great information for you. We've done plenty of programs on this topic. We've had Professor McQueen debate this topic as well. The playlist is in the description box. That being said, we've got some new findings and some new data to present tonight as well, guys. So you're definitely going to want to stay for the entire talk. That being said, before we get right into it, a couple announcements. We've got Dr. Joseph Kazil back here this Wednesday for a must-watch technical presentation. It's going to be up to date on all the latest research and data. The presentation is titled, "What is Junk DNA?" So that is going to go over the overturning of junk DNA, which is bad for the evolutionists. That's going to be a ton of fun. Tomorrow, we've also got John McKay, the creation guy, back with us. I believe it's at 6 o'clock EST for a presentation and talk on design. We've also got Professor David McQueen back with us next Monday for flood geology of the Grand Canyon. So that is going to be a ton of fun as well. Also, you guys probably saw the community post, the new Human Evolution Handbook. The cover's done. That should be probably about a month, and that book will be released. We're just kind of finishing it up. So lots to look forward to. And that being said, we are going to get right into it. The format for the night actually is going to be, we're going to be starting off with myself. I have about a 20-minute presentation showing why the Bible undeniably demonstrates and teaches a worldwide flood. That's going to set the foundation for the night. Then, of course, we are going to deal with the heat problem. Before I get into my presentation, though, gentlemen, is there anything you guys wanted to say in terms of introduction? Professor McQueen, George, Matt?
Yeah, I'd like to say something.
Go ahead, brother. Yeah, take your time.
And I always say this at the beginning. May the Spirit of God open your eyes to the light, your ears to the truth, and your heart to his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Remember what John said in 3:12. He says, "If I have told you of earthly things, and ye believe not, how shall ye believe if I tell you of heavenly things?" Now remember, a couple of things here. What we're going to present, I know I've got some mathematics. These are hypotheses. There are assumptions built into them. But please remember, the opposite side has also got hypotheses. Okay? Yes. So keep that in mind. Thanks, Donnie.
And I will kick off mine in Hebrews chapter 1. I would encourage our class to go back and read that because it clearly presents the Lord Jesus as the creator. It talks about angels, it talks about us. But let's keep our focus on the fact that even though we're going to spend hours over the next couple of months talking about the heat problem, YEC has got a viewpoint. SFT is going to lay the foundation about what the Bible says about a worldwide flood. But remember that to our opponents, it's not so much a heat problem as a model problem or a problem of who is the Lord Jesus? Is he the creator? Is he the one that directed the activities of the flood? Ponder that as Standing for Truth goes through his intro.
I appreciate the opening words, brothers David and George. Matt, I'm liking the shirt. It looks familiar, brother.
Must have been a sale.
Yeah.
Must have been buy two for the price of one. So we thought we couldn't pass up on that. If you guys
go ahead, brother. Go ahead.
YEC,
By Christmas, George and I are going to make our own shirt, the George and Dave show, but we'll save that.
All right, good.
Please. That'll be awesome. Anyone in the audience likes the shirts and clothing and SFT gear coming onto Team SFT, check creationistclothing.com. So that being said, gentlemen, I'm going to get right into it. I do have some slides as well to present in laying down the foundation for tonight. But I want to start off with a straw man argument that I see being put forth by many old Earth creationists. Okay, so it's this straw man argument pertaining to an appearance of age, saying that we put forth a God that is deceitful. Okay, now the thing is, God is not deceitful, of course. God did not create an earth and a universe that look old. And what I mean by this is when people say the earth and the universe look old, they are demonstrating what it means to be indoctrinated. Okay. For example, how would you know what a 35-year-old man looked like if you had no experience watching people grow from birth to age 35? How old was Adam 2 hours after his creation? Okay, that's a good question to ask yourselves. How old would Adam say he looked if you were to ask him this question? Hey, Adam, how old do you look? Adam would not have had a frame of reference where he has seen somebody born and then mature to adolescence and then adulthood. Without that experience, Adam would have no ability to understand the concept of age. Does this universe look old? Does the earth look old? Two important questions. Well, do we have another universe and another earth to compare our universe and our earth to? Of course not. So the question should be, what would an old universe and what would a young universe and earth look like? The earth and the universe, without any indoctrination, looks young, yet decayed and eroded. There's no other proxies that we have to compare this earth and this universe to. Okay, so as you guys know, we're going to be debunking the heat problem. And before we get into the fun of addressing the heat problem and the objections raised by the old earthers, what I want to do is first demonstrate why the scriptures undeniably teach a young earth, a literal historical Genesis, and a real worldwide flood. Firstly, Genesis is written as a historical narrative. One of the indications of this is the frequent use of the vav consecutive. When we read, and this happened, and that happened, and this happened. Okay, you can go read Genesis yourself to see what I'm talking about. Genesis 1 after verse 2 is a vav consecutive, and followed by a verb, okay, in the Hebrew word order, that indicates a sequence of events. And this is what we see after Genesis verse 2. Therefore, this has to be read as a historical narrative. This isn't symbolic or poetry, as many have put forth. This is talking about real historical events. There's no way around this. These events really took place, and these symbolic interpretations do not work. Now, of course, the genealogists, the genealogies take us right back to Adam. And from Adam to Jesus. Adam is the first Adam, and Jesus is the last Adam. This is all real history we are looking at in Genesis. The genealogies take us back just roughly 6,000 years ago, and Jesus Christ himself said, from the beginning of creation, he made them male and female. Okay, it doesn't say from the beginning of the creation of man, no, the beginning of creation. And if the genealogies take us back to Adam, who is then created at the beginning of creation, all you have to work with is roughly 6,000 years. There's no other way around it. I'm sorry. The apostles and Jesus himself took the Genesis account as a literal historical narrative. Okay, so let's go to the account in Genesis of the flood. Is it a global flood that we're dealing with or a local flood? Well, the Bible clearly says, and you can read it for yourself, that all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered, okay? And only Noah and his family survived. Not to mention that we have the genetic data that takes us right back to a few founding couples that we have all descended from. The old earthers have not dealt with that genetic data. Okay. So there's no doubt that we are looking at a global flood unless you willingly choose not to see it. The only reason people challenge a global flood is because you cannot have both millions of years and a global flood. You can't have both. A main line of evidence for an old earth is what? It's fossils. Billions of fossils that we see in these sedimentary layers. So they would assert that these fossils have been deposited over millions and millions of years. And a global flood, as we know, would deposit most of these fossils in one flood. These fossils are continent-wide. We find them in every single sediment layer for the most part. And the sediments cover entire continents. But in an old earth creation model, a global flood would destroy the fossil record. That's why they can't have millions of years and a fossil record, because the global flood that the Bible plainly teaches would destroy this fossil record that they want to look to. See how circular it is? They want to look to the fossil record as evidence for millions to billions of years. So you cannot have deep time and you cannot have a global flood at the same time. This is why many Christians, unfortunately, have to reject the plain reading of Scripture and choose to believe in a local flood instead. Now, here's an important thing to consider, okay? Jesus Christ himself compares the coming judgment by fire to the days of Noah. The coming judgment will be a global judgment, of course. I don't think anybody's going to argue against that. But this is a global judgment in the same way that the flood of Noah was a global and worldwide event. It wouldn't make any sense hermeneutically for the flood of Noah and logically to be a localized event in the same way that the coming judgment by fire would be localized. And a few questions to consider. Why would Noah build a massive ark, take 2 of every kind of animal, including birds, if it were just a local flood? Even a continent-wide flood, as some old earth creationists put forth, would not make any sense. Noah had 100 years to build the ark. Even if it were a continent-wide flood, Noah could move anywhere in the world in 100 years. This is why the flood was clearly global for hermeneutical reasons, logical reasons, scientific reasons. There's no way around it. And when it comes to the ark, this is exactly why an ark was required in the first place, because even in 100 years, there's no way to escape the flood that was coming. But if it just took place on one continent or a localized area, it's not going to work, okay? And I want to point out, actually, the flood itself is beautiful proof that the majority is oftentimes wrong. Only 8 people, consider this, only 8 people survived the flood of Noah. The majority was wrong in those days in the same way that today the majority is wrong. So that being said, I want to share screen, and I think I've got some good slides here. Is my audio coming in okay, gentlemen?
Sounds great to me.
Okay. So let's see. Okay, so you can see the screen? All right, awesome. Let me just take a sip of water here. So clearly what we have here then, for those that want to deny the fact that the Bible teaches a global flood, is compromise. Now the question is, what motivates compromise? Okay, and I've got this, and I like the way that they put this. First thing I would ask this translator is, and I suggest reading this whole article, why do you want to avoid treating Genesis as history? That's the question for these Christians that want to reject Genesis as literal history, or even those that admit, okay, you know, due to the Vav consecutive, due to the Hebrew grammatical language, it's obviously literal history, but what we're looking at is billions of years, or we're looking at a local flood. Well, here's a good question. Is there some insight from the biblical text that Josephus, Basil the Great, and most other church fathers, even Augustine and Origen, Thomas Aquinas, and all the reformers, including Luther and Calvin, overlooked? Because remember, all of these models, progressive creationism, gap theory, day-age theory, theistic evolution, of course, these are all new inventions. They are foreign to church history. George, can you mute yourself, brother? Because I can hear a lot of feedback, which is fine, no worries. Is there a perceived need to fit in with uniformitarian long ages or evolution? Many who deny the straightforward reading are upfront with this, as documented in Refuting Compromise. That is a book I have not seen, Refuted. And we've had Dr. Jonathan Sarfati on numerous times. That is way too often the reasoning is something like, well, the text seems to teach creation. And remember, many secular Hebrew scholars agree. Of course, this is talking about 6 literal days and a worldwide flood. Okay, while the text seems to teach creation in 6 ordinary days a few thousand years ago, this contradicts modern science such as radiometric dating. So they're going with the science first. They're starting with the science and putting that into the Bible where it doesn't belong. That's a classic case of what's called eisegesis as compared to exegesis. Okay, they're reading their ideas about science into the text where it doesn't belong. Let's go to Peter's perspective. 2 Peter 3, where we see, as earlier I was talking about, the comparison of the coming judgment by fire, which is global, worldwide, obviously. It's not just judgment by fire in America, Australia, or Canada. No, it's worldwide. You can't escape this judgment by fire in the same way you could not escape the worldwide flood of Noah. Okay, so I want to read this. I think this is great. But was he thinking of the world in a restricted sense, referring to only part of the earth? No, in the very next chapter, Peter brings up the flood again. There he sets up a contrast between the pre-flood world, right, the world that then existed, which was destroyed by water, and the heavens and the earth that now exist, which will be judged by fire. 2 Peter 3, 6-7. Clearly, the present heavens and earth is universal. But then the comparison indicates that the extent of the pre-flood world, which was deluged with water and perished, is also universal. Peter plainly thought the flood engulfed the entire world, not just a part of it. Okay, sadly, however, and they point to Longman and Walton, never even mention this passage, let alone a response. Okay, so here's another couple contextual reasons why when we see the word all over and over and over again in the Genesis account of the flood, we see that it's clearly talking about all in a universal sense, in a worldwide sense, okay? So there has been much written over the years about why Noah's flood had to be global. Following are some of the arguments. If the flood was local, then why did Noah spend over 100 years building an ark when all he had to do was move, as I talked about earlier, to a part of the globe where the flood waters would not reach? Why build an ark over 400 feet long if it was only a local flood? These are questions I'd like to see actual answers to, not rescue devices. Is it not hard to imagine a local flood that lasted over a year? If the flood was local, then did God break his promise not to flood the world again? Hasn't the Mesopotamian valley even flooded many times since Noah? The promise of God wouldn't make any sense in a local flood. Okay, the fact is as well that we all come from Noah, and the science has confirmed this. Okay, the genetic data has confirmed the Tower of Babel dispersal, the global flood account, the fact that Adam and Eve were specially created. Okay, all people are descendants of Noah and his family. And you can look at the genealogies of Adam yourself and Noah. They're exclusive. They take us right back to just 3 founding couples just thousands of years ago. Okay, even if you wanted to throw in some big gaps, you're not going to get it. This is important. And I'm going to start winding down here because I could talk about this all day. So let's look at the Hebrew terminology that confirms a global flood. The word eretz. Okay, the earth, Hebrew word eretz, is used 46 times in the flood account in Genesis 6-9, as well as in Genesis 1. The explicit link to the big picture of creation, especially in Genesis 6, verses 6-7, clearly implies a universal flood. Furthermore, the judgment of God is pronounced not just on all flesh, okay, pay attention to this, not just on all flesh, but on the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Okay, here's the fatal blow to the local flood theory. Okay, under the whole heaven. Is this just a certain part of the? Here's what I find funny. If God wanted to tell us that this was a localized flood, he did it the worst way possible. Okay, all the language that we find is universal worldwide. There's nothing that we find here about localized. That's why the local flood proponents are always on the defense. We can sit here and quote scripture all day, but then they're on the defense about the scripture the entire time. So under the whole heaven is used 6 times outside of the flood. Let's do a word study. Outside of the flood account in the Old Testament, always with a universal meaning. Okay, you can look at these references, Deuteronomy, Job. Daniel. For example, whatever is under the whole heaven is mine, saith the Lord. So according to the local flood proponents, only a localized part under the whole heaven is his. No, of course, this truly means that whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. There's no logical or hermeneutical justification to put a localized flood in Genesis 7 where it does not belong. Under the whole heaven literally means under the whole heaven, especially when you approach it from just scripture using sound hermeneutics. Okay. Fountains of the great deep, all the fountains of the great deep. The fountains of the great deep are mentioned only in the flood account and Proverbs 8:28. The deep, okay, Hebrew word tahom, relates back to creation, Genesis 1:2, where it refers to the one ocean covering the whole world before the land was formed. And it was not just the fountains of the great deep, but all the fountains of the great deep which broke open. Okay. And we have evidence for this in science when it comes to the cracking up of the earth like an eggshell. And we still see evidence of this. Okay. So this is the last slide I want to go to because I think this is important. So a big objection that I think for the most part we dealt with, but let's leave no stone unturned. So what they'll say is all does not really mean all. Okay. Some have argued, and this is what we always see. Some have argued that since all does not always mean each and every, right? Because we have examples throughout this in scripture, Mark 1 verses 5, for example, the use of all in the flood account does not necessarily mean the flood was universal is what these old earth creationists will say. That is, they claim that the use of all allows for a local flood. Well, is this true? Let's see. However, the meaning of a word is decided by the context, right? The context is key, of course. From the context of all in Luke 2 verse 1, for example, we can see that all the world meant all the Roman Empire. So it is the context that tells us that all here does not mean every bit of the whole land surface of the globe. Similarly, to determine the meaning of all in Genesis 6-9, we must consider the context. So let's go consider the context of Genesis 6-9, okay? Not just transfer the inferred meaning from somewhere else. The word all, Hebrew word kol, is used 72 times in the 85 verses of Genesis 6-9. 21% of all the times it is used in all 50 chapters of Genesis. In Genesis 7, verse 19, we read that all, the high mountains under all the heavens were covered. Note, this is important, guys. Note the double use of all. So we have a double use of all to dictate the context. In Hebrew, this gives emphasis so as to eliminate any possibility of ambiguity. This could be accurately translated as all the high mountains under the entire heavens. Guys, there's no other way around this. We're dealing with a worldwide flood, clearly, whether you look at the English or the Hebrew and the context, of course, okay? So all the high mountains under the entire heaven. To reflect the emphasis in the Hebrew, Leopold, in his authoritative commentary on Genesis, said of this, the text disposes of the question of the universality of the flood. Okay, so in a nutshell, clearly what we're dealing with when it comes to Genesis is a worldwide flood. There's no other way around it. Does the science confirm this? Yes. We spent hours and hours and hours. We've got a playlist with Professor McQueen with over 20 to 25 videos showing all the evidence that confirms the account in Genesis of a worldwide flood. We don't have to just throw in a local flood where it does not belong. Now we know there is a problem that exists called the heat problem. Okay, starting from the scriptures, holy men spake as they were moved by the Holy Ghost. Okay, the scriptures are under divine inspiration from God himself. So let us now let's see if we can come up with some plausible solutions to this so-called heat problem. Now that we know definitively that the scriptures teach a worldwide flood and there's no other way around it. Go ahead, I yield, gentlemen.
Can I ask you a question, SFT?
Sure.
If the world will be judged by fire, will there be local fires or one huge fire?
Well, it says lake of fire.
You see where I'm going?
Right. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. No, and that's so important that even old earth creationists that I feel like have been in the game for a long time, when I ask that simple question, why should we hermeneutically, when we look at 2 Peter 3 and interpret scripture with scripture, and we see that the scoffers in the last days are going to deny three things: the special creation, Also the global flood, right? The world that then was being overflowed with water perished, and the coming judgment by fire. So the special creation event was obviously universal wide. No one's going to say that God only created part of the universe. He created it all. And the third thing that they're going to deny is the coming judgment by fire. That's universal as well. But for no reason at all, we're just going to throw in the middle. The second event that the scoffers deny is something local. That doesn't fit logically, hermeneutically, scientifically. No, it makes the most sense that all three events are worldwide and universal. So
I have a comment as well. This is in the Bible as well. It talks about the waters of this flood. Let's say it was local. How can a local flood cover the highest mountains by 15 cubits? For those of you that don't know what a cubit is, it's about 22.5 feet. So if a flood is literally coming out of a mountain from, like, let's say a spring, or matter of fact, let's say all of humanity lived inside of a volcano, and the volcano itself had a fountain in it, and it broke open, and it filled up to the top to kill all humanity that was inside of it. You still wouldn't get 22 feet of water hanging over the entire sides of the volcano. I mean, that's an experiment you could run in a small scale, right? That doesn't make any sense either. So how would a local flood logically conclude that that would be a plausible thing from Scripture itself? Okay, you got to think about that for you as well.
Amen, brother. Amen. Well said. Well said. Well, that being said, we just hit the half an hour mark. Took me about 25 minutes to get through that. So much great information, though, guys. I had to condense 5 hours probably worth of information into just a 25 minute presentation. So it's what the Bible teaches. And as you're going to see, and as you have seen, the scientific data confirms that. Professor David McQueen, once again, thanks so much for being here. You're a huge blessing to this channel. Now that we've set the way and laid down the foundation for the rest of the show, I want to hand it over to you, brother, for your presentation.
Unmuted. Oh, there we go. I want to compliment the three of you, YAC and SFT and George, for the wonderful job that you have done in laying out this issue. The summary that you just gave, SFT, for an argument for a worldwide flood is an excellent look at what the Scripture says in Peter and other places. I want to give a special compliment to George. He's done a tremendous amount of work in the last 2 weeks in gathering a number of engineering and physics and thermodynamic arguments about this issue of the worldwide. This issue of the resolution of the heat problem, the ENDGAME. I may only be able to be with you for 1 quarter today. We've got some technical problems here in Louisiana, and I myself am recovering from a dental visit this morning. So let me go ahead and give my 20 minutes and then see how much longer I can last, George. Is that okay?
Fine, David.
Okay. I want to lay some groundwork to this whole issue of the heat problem. And I want to emphasize one bit of data that George is going to use a screen share later on to illustrate some very new information regarding the nature of the crust, the mantle, and the core. Now, I hope you'll remember from your earth science classes in the past that the earth is broken into, as you can see here, the inner core, the outer core, the mantle, and the crust. And we want to focus today on some new data regarding the area of the outer core mantle boundary. Here's an example, a simplified version of a diagram that George is going to show you in 30 minutes that shows South Africa down. Remember, my use of the tree means that this is a cross section. if you go down through South Africa, you go to the crust, then there's the crust mantle boundary. Many people call that the asthenosphere. And then if you keep on going down, you get to the outer core where we're going to have our focus. Now,
I can share that diagram if you like, David.
Yes, show them that diagram, and then I'll get my next simplification ready. Please share that. This is some fascinating geophysics here. And there it is. Those are the blobs on the outer core mantle boundary. And George will continue with this more. And let's talk about the geophysics of that. Just as you go around the globe, you see these things are a blob, and they have connections or conduits or pipes. I don't quite know what word to use that move up from there. Excellent series of diagrams that were produced just a couple of years ago. And there's the one of South Africa. If you go back one, George.
That one, yeah.
That's the one showing the blob beneath South Africa. But many of you don't remember a lot of your high school. Oh, that's a great picture there.
Yeah, one there.
Notice that he calls this branches and cusp. I'll suggest some other words. But let's get some of the basic vocabulary back. Thank you, George. And let me give me my screen back here. Okay. Many of you have gone to the doctor to get what some called years ago a CAT scan. It's now simply called a CT scan of our body. Now, keep in mind that when I was in my 20s and 30s, this was not possible. This idea of computer tomography, this is only possible because of an increase in computing data. And so when you look at these details of the geophysics of South Africa, and you see this blob down there, this is discovered by manipulation of seismic waves that are produced during earthquakes. When an earthquake strikes, different kinds of waves called P waves and S waves move through the earth. I have taught about this for years, as I have taught geophysics. And here's a diagram from a book that I used in my teaching and that I was actually taught from. This is Stacy's book, University of Queensland, back in 1969, Physics of the Earth. Well, if you look at the details of this, it gets pretty complex with these kinds of calculations and so forth that you have to do. You'll see the different differential equations there. But this chart at the top here shows a value of shear as a function of depth. And you'll notice at the bottom it goes all the way out, way down to 3,000. Now, how can we best understand this in a simple way? Well, if you look at the diagram behind me, whenever there's an earthquake in Africa, it sends energy down, and those are picked up by seismographs. A diagram like this one that I put together, which shows the details of what it looks like underneath the crust of Africa. We have talked before about kimberlite pipes. It is true, Jamie, that God did make it all. That's true. So here's the crust. There is the kimberlite pipes that we've talked about in the dark there. That's bringing up diamonds from the lower mantle. Well, what George has introduced me to in this paper that came out in a couple of years ago rather, is that this kimberlite pipe here, that this connection or this conduit brings up the thermodynamics of the mantle. Now, that's a lot of big vocabulary. Let's try to simplify it as best we can. And I've got a number of models to show you that might help you see it. We borrowed the Play-Doh of our grandchildren, and Ms. McQueen helped me put this together. The green is the mountains on top of the crust. The white ball in the middle is the inner core. And then the outer core is that silver zone you see. And there's the red blob that we've been talking about in that area. Now, how do we gather data about this? Well, we gather it in geophysics using what is called a geophone. And we can have some fun. Here's the phone that I had when we moved here to Louisiana 30 years ago.
Even I had one of those phones back in the day, Professor McQueen.
Oh, so you guys know, but
Yes.
many of the people that are born and raised in the 21st century may not know the joy of this kind of phone. Sometimes when I'm talking with SFT on the phone, I'll say, let me put the receiver down. Well, that's old vocabulary for putting my cell phone down. And when I say I would dial SFT, I don't punch the buttons. Do you see that this part moves? And that's how you would dial somebody. But this is the part I enjoyed the most. You're talking to your brother-in-law and you're tired of hearing him. What you can do is you can slam the receiver down. You hear me? You hear me? I'm tired of you. So that's a little bit of humor there. Now, how does this tie in to geophysics? Well, if you imagine a ship going offshore Africa, and it's going from South Africa to the west, they would lower a geophone into the water so that the geophone would go down in the water, and then up in the ship itself, there is a receiver. Then they would set off an explosion. Bam! The geophone would then record the movement of that wavefront down through the sediment. And if you've got a big enough explosion, an explosion like an earthquake, it will go all the way through the earth as P waves and shear waves. And that allows us to move on to an understanding of this remarkable example of a argument that deals with the heat problem. You know, I've been thinking about this for a week and working through the math. I haven't got to the thermodynamics yet, but let's look at this part of my diagram here. Let me fold it over to emphasize it. You know, this connection or the conduit that's coming down, I borrowed one of my grandchildren's. When we have tea parties, sometimes we drink our tea and things like this. The yellow is the base of the crust. The curvy line is the conduit going down to the red blob at the outer core mantle boundary. Well, what if this part going down at some part of the flood brought up kimberlites? Boom! And so they come up to the surface, and that's where we get the diamonds. But what if it works both ways? Ms. McQueen gave me a paper towel roll from our kitchen. Let's imagine this is a conduit, but let's imagine that it can go two ways. What if this part here is up at the base of the ocean as rapid continental separation is going on and continental drift? And so again, to borrow the blocks from my grandchildren here you got these plates moving. During the first part of the flood, they break, and begin to subduct and move underneath each other, what if at the bottom of this one, you have got one of these conduits that have been discovered recently? Could the thermodynamics work both ways? Could this actually take heat down so that, to use my model here, you've got heat being taken down from this subducting area here down to this blob? Wouldn't that be a wonderful resolution to the heat problem, where you have a situation, the way that teenagers talk nowadays? I wouldn't use this vocabulary, but teenagers might say, well, Professor McQueen, those blobs suck. Well, what if they really do suck thermodynamically and they take the heat down instead of up? George is going to introduce us here in a few minutes to the number of watts. You know what a watt is, like a light bulb, 100 watt, 60 watt. Well, George is going to take it one step further to the physics of a joule. This is not spelled like a diamond or a ruby, not that kind of joule. It's another kind of joule, but it's a measure of heat. What if those tremendous numbers of joules and watts that our opponents have argued now for a year produce an unbreakable, unbeatable heat problem? It's not unbreakable. It's not unbeatable. It doesn't mean that the water of Noah's flood, with all the dinosaurs and humans that are dying in the flood, it doesn't mean that that heat, like they say, is going to vaporize Noah's ocean so that the ark ends up coming to rest on a dry, shallow seafloor thousands of feet down and everybody dies on the ark. No, it's not necessary at all. I think that the physics and the thermodynamics of this whole idea of the blob and conduits going up from it, what if the thermodynamics shows an unexpected thing? What if this is a heat sink, taking that heat down the hole that Alice and the rabbit go through in Alice in Wonderland, and then when they get to the bottom, the blob itself underneath South Africa actually absorbs that heat. So I want to pause there. What do the three of you think of that idea?
That's a good hypothesis. As I said, we have hypotheses and they have hypotheses, and it works fine. And I'll show later that they actually have a bigger heat problem, much bigger heat problem that I don't think they've ever considered, but I'll introduce that to them later.
Right. What I'd like to do is invite YEC and also George to ask me a question based on this, and then I will step to one side and allow my other colleagues here to comment about this. But first, gentlemen, what does this presentation bring to your mind?
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say he's standing there.
He's away for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, go ahead, George. Go ahead, brother. If you want to give your thoughts before we move on to the next presentation, go ahead.
No, I was actually going to add to that by saying I remember having a conversation with Joseph Hubbard and John McKay. In understanding limestone, you can't just look at it from a geological point of view. There's also a lot of chemistry there. So when you're looking at limestone, you need not only to look at geology, but you also have to look at chemistry to get the whole picture. And when you do that, you find the solution. I mean, I read a paper just this morning on and we know, by the way, volcanoes produce limestone because we've seen it. This particular paper said there's as much carbon, probably even more, trapped inside the surface of the Earth than there is above it. So imagine how much limestone can be produced by that carbon coming out of the mantle and crust. That's the point I want to make. Remember, there's not one field of science that can solve this problem. It's a multiple scientific proposal. You need to marry a number of things to actually solve it. So hopefully, hopefully I'll add some climatology or meteorology to the subject, so we can understand a little bit more about it. So can I take over, David?
Those of you that have followed George and I over the last 4 months will recognize this temperature, pH, EH, mole, partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of CO2. This is exactly the chemistry that George is talking about. That George, take over. I'm going to step to one side.
Okay.
I do have one question that came in based on what you said from the audience. Now I know we got a ton of information. Do you want me to present it to you, Professor McQueen, or should
Yes, please. I don't want to take from George's time, but go ahead.
So here would be an argument from a critic to that, and I guess what would be your thoughts based on this hypothesis? To somebody who says there's too much heat for even that to work, the core would have to become hotter than the surface of the sun. What would be some thoughts on that, Professor McQueen?
Andrew, thank you for that question, and it's a legitimate post. My friend George has only presented this data, this paper, this 3-year-old paper, to me a week ago. So I actually haven't had the time to work through the thermodynamics of it. I am simply suggesting that it may be that the thermodynamics works in a young Earth favor. Standing for Truth has already demonstrated that Scripture teaches that the Earth must be young. And so I think the thermodynamics of this may be remarkable. I haven't worked through the equations, but as you'll see in a moment, George has gathered a tremendous amount of data about the thermodynamics associated with coal, crude oil, and other limestones and so forth. So I'm optimistic that there'll be a solution. Remember that we're in a group here, in an environment that's standing for truth. I used to work for the Institute for Creation Research, not the Institute for Creation Answers. I don't have the answer now, but in 30 days I may. George, can you take it over from there?
Amen. Well said. Well said. And I think that's the perfect way to now transition into George's presentation, which I think is going to significantly back up your presentation. So what I like about this so far is we're about to hit the hour mark. We've set the foundation for the first 25, 30 minutes, demonstrating that the scriptures indeed do teach a worldwide flood. The old earth creationists are just going to have to accept that, or really just continue putting forth, in my opinion, and the opinion of others, just really weak, compromising type argument. So now we're going to...
SFT, if you could drop my video, I'll take the 1 hour break.
Okay, here we go. Brother George, we're going to give you the floor now.
Okay, as I said, we need to consider a number of sciences when we look at this. So to start off with, I'll just give you a bit of an introduction into how the Earth's heat is distributed. Okay, the Earth effectively redistributes heat from the equator towards the poles, but also from the Earth's surface and lower atmosphere back into space. If this doesn't happen, the Earth would endlessly heat up. Now, the land surfaces, oceans, and atmosphere absorbs an average of about 240 watts of solar power per square meter. I'm just giving you some basic information here, right? So, Professor McQueen mentioned...
if you need to screen share, brother, you just let me in, Matt.
No worries. Professor McQueen mentioned the relationship between watts and joules. Well, this is how you actually convert 1 watt per square meter of energy per second equals 1 joule. That's my understanding. So 1 watt per square meter per second equals 1 joule. So the atmosphere and ocean work, as I said, non-stop to even out the solar heating imbalances through evaporation of the surface water, the convection, rainfall, winds, and ocean circulation. This is coupled with the atmosphere and ocean circulation is known as the Earth's engine. What I'm telling you here comes straight from a NASA website, okay? It's not me blabbering creationist material. So it's something that comes from NASA. Now, some of you might have heard about Earth's energy budget. So what is the Earth's energy budget? Well, it's the amount of heat a surface radiates. This is proportional to the fourth power of its temperature. For example, if a temperature doubles, the radiated energy increases by a factor of 16. That's 2 to the fourth power, double to the fourth power. So if the temperature of the Earth rises, the planet rapidly emits an increasing amount of heat to space. This large increase in heat loss in response to a relatively smaller increase in temperature, referred to as the radiative cooling, is the primary mechanism that prevents runaway heating on Earth. Now, Earth's temperature doesn't infinitely rise because the surface and the atmosphere are simultaneously radiating heat into space. Now, get a load of this. This is the net flow energy into and out of the Earth system. This is what's called the Earth's energy budget. And that comes from the earthobservatory.nasa.gov website. Okay, so some basics. You see that at around about 100 kilometers, I think this is considered the edge of space. The temperature will reach a temperature of roughly the CMB, which is 2.73 Kelvin. That's absolute zero, where 0 K. So reaching absolute zero, by the way, at 100 K at Earth's surface. But near absolute, so you can't have absolute zero because when you're out in space, you're actually at 2.73. So you really should be saying near absolute. It's close. It's closer to zero that it's not funny. Okay, you look at, say, a hot air balloon, for example. It keeps rising, and as it rises, it cools down. Then they have to add heat to keep the balloon up. All right, without going into too much of the details, this is what I'll do with regards to what Professor McQueen was talking about. I'll introduce you to some mathematics here. I've looked at. Okay, I'm going to share the screen now, SFT. So if you can just give me the screen. Okay, I looked at a number of. Can you see that?
Yep.
Hello?
Yep, I made it full screen for everybody.
Okay. So you see there's specific heats of various materials there, water or substances, water, coal, granite, limestone, quartzite, coal, limestone, right through wet mud, oil, etc. Now I looked at the various information that I found on the website about the quantities of the coal and the oils and so forth and even the water. If you look at the water, keeping in mind there are reports of a substance called ringwoodite. By their own admission, ringwoodite can contain as much as 3 times the surface water that we see on the surface. So when you look at all the various sources of water, groundwater, the ringwoodite, there's some references regarding those figures I gave you before. You can calculate the absorption of energy or the heat of that volume of water. So you can see there in one full year, and we say that this occurred over a full year. You're talking about 0.17 by 10 to the 30th joules. Now, you might say, okay, well, that's not close enough to the 1.51 by 10 to the 30th joules that a secular mechanical engineer determined. but keep in mind that's 11% of the figure determined by that particular bloke. So we go through all the various parts of the crustal basalt, the crustal granite, and we go to the summary. You'll see the cold limestone, oil, gas. I wasn't able to determine that. The air and water, even though they're minor in comparison to the 1.51 by 10 to the 30th joule. We'll look at for example, the mantle. Increasing the mantle's temperature by 300 degrees centigrade, for example, results in a storage of 1.01 by 10 to the 30th joules of heat. If you increase the temperature of the mantle by an additional 350 degrees centigrade, you get a 1.18 by 10 to the 30th joule. And that's closer to the 1.51. Now, the reason I've done this is because who can actually tell me what the actual temperature of the mantle was, say, 4,500 years ago? You can't. So I'm hypothesizing here that the mantle was 350 degrees cooler back then, and it rose by an extra 350 degrees centigrade. So when you look at the total stored heat in the mantle for the 350 degrees centigrade, you find we get 1.49 by 10 to the 30th joule versus the 1.51 by 10 to the 30th joules that was determined by the secular source. And if you increase it by 400, you actually I think I've done the I think that one's wrong, actually, that one there, but 400 degrees centigrade gives you a closer estimate to the 1.51. So as I've said there, so we can see that a mere 400 degree centigrade increase in the mantle temperature can absorb all the accelerated radioactive heat. Now, keep in mind, you have to look at the entire mantle here, because there's a volume. You can find this information. I think I've got it somewhere. I got it from one of the there you go, the Science Direct website. The volume of basalt in the crust is estimated at blah blah. Where's the mantle? The Earth's mantle is a layer of silicate rock between the crust and other outer core. It has a mass of 4.01 by 10 to the 24th kilogram, and thus makes up 67% of the mass of the Earth. And that comes from a Wikipedia source. Now that's one hypothesis, right? Now let's go look at the other method of the blobs, which Professor McQueen spoke about. These blobs, you can see there that particular article came out in 2019. It clearly states these mysterious hunks of rock are called large low shear velocity provinces, or I think you've seen in one of the diagram it had LLSVP, right? Now there are two blobs. Professor McQueen only showed you one, but there are two blobs, one below the Pacific Ocean and the other beneath Africa, which is what Professor McQueen was talking about. And these come from, according to secular people, from reliable sources. Okay, so I've got a number of links there which effectively say the same thing. So what I did was, based on this particular report where it said these blobs are so big that they would drown the planet's surface in a lava ocean over 60 miles deep. That's around, say, rounded off to 100 kilometers. And their own distinct entity, and not just a particular warm region of the core. The problem here is I couldn't find anywhere in their reports what the temperature of these blobs were in relation to the remaining, to the rest of the core, the surrounding core. What they state is it's hotter than the surrounding core. This leads sort of an obvious question is, if these blobs have been around for 4.5 billion years, guys, 4.5 billion years, why haven't they reached equilibrium with the surrounding temperature of the mantle? Okay, So using that particular information, I was able to calculate the literal volume of these blobs. Okay, I think you've seen all that. That diagram, and you can see they're 1.5 to 3.5% denser than the rest of the Earth's mantle. So something's different about these blobs, but there was nothing I could find about their temperature. All right, so here's the heat solution method to the blobs. Calculating the volume, assuming a temperature of 1650 degrees centigrade for these blobs, and I'll tell you why I chose that a little bit later. You can actually find that the heat stored in those blobs at the moment is 14% of the secular value of 1.1 by 10 to the 30th joule. Now, here's the thing, right? This is what I've made. This is the assumption. And I'll be honest, I've made assumptions, but there are assumptions in the secular models as well. If we also assume these blobs have been cooling to the surrounding mantle temperature for the last 4,500 years, that is the time of the flood, at a rate of, say, 10% every 500 years, then the initial heat of these blobs would have been 9 times, or in other words, if 10% of that is 0.15, so 9 times 0.15 plus the 2.1 of the stored energy in the blobs, look what you get. You get 1.56 by 10 to the 30th joule. Now that's 3% above the value determined by secular sources of the 1.51 by 10 to the 30th joules. Now, if you don't like that assumption, alternatively, the blobs may have been larger in size, cooling down, and therefore reduced in size over 1,400 years. So you look at the alternative and ask yourself why these blobs haven't reached equilibrium to the surrounding area if the Earth was 4.5 billion years old. So I've got a few other bits and pieces there that sort of suggest that this particular article here by Chris Marone, a professor in geoscience at the Penn State, states that up to 90% of the Earth's interior is fueled by decaying of radioactive isotopes like potassium, uranium, etc. These isotopes radiate heat as they shed excess energy and move towards stability. So you can see the actual accelerated radioactive decay could have occurred deep down into the Earth, and some of that radioactive material might have been forced up to the surface through volcanic activity, and that's why we find it on the continents today. That's my hypothesis, but think of the alternative. The secular sources state that because uranium and those other super heavy elements are super heavy, ask yourself, if iron and nickel can sink to the bottom of the core, why the super heavy elements haven't also. That if anything, you should find right at the inner core and outer core, you should find the super heavy elements. But no, they suggest that these could be in the mantle. But then you've got to ask yourself, why do we find them in the crust if they're super heavy? Well, the secular explanation is, hello, it's the old version of the impact theory. They were delivered on the Earth's surface at a later date. Well, let's look at that. Okay, in Australia, for example, we find 30% of the world's uranium in Australia, and 23% of the thorium is also found in Australia. So are you trying to tell me that out of all these impacts that occurred that brought the uranium, it just managed to hit Australia mostly? And what evidence is there to suggest that occurred? There should be some evidence. Now, I mentioned that I'm going to present some problems for the old Earth evolutionist story. One of the stories that we hear is, how did the Earth's water appear on Earth? And one of the stories is that water-laden comets actually struck the Earth over the 4.5 billion years. Now, we've done some rough calculation. What I'm saying, CMI have done some rough calculations on this and equated it to the Barringer crater, and then converted that to number of Hiroshima bombs. And in that 4.5 billion years, their heat problem is over 340 times greater than the 1.51 by 10 to the 30th joules that the secular source determined. So I will claim you have got a bigger problem than us. If you then assume that these ice comets actually hit the Earth in, say, after the 1 billion years that it took to cool down, your problem becomes worse. Then you've got that amount of heat in less time. So when you point the finger at someone's eye, or the log in someone's eye, you really have to look at your own eye and pick the splint out of your own eye. I think I've got that one around the wrong way, but I think you get my point. But I can present you a number, I call them a shed load of other evidences which present huge problems for the secular models that they don't like to visit or admit. But they point to the heat problem that creationists are presented with. And we've shown you a couple of hypotheses here where that heat can be absorbed in the mantle, either through the blobs or the mantle itself. And some of it through radiated heat through the crust elements and the water up into space. So I think that's about it for my presentation. I've got other information. I think, as Professor McQueen mentioned, we really can devote about a 5-part series to this of 2 hours length. It's that big if you consider all the bits and pieces of information that we've gathered. But generally, I want to present those 2 bits of information, and I hope to present this information to the blokes at CMI, AOG, and ICR, and see if they can take it up and maybe advance it even further. Thanks.
And I want to say, great presentation. I also want to get the thoughts from Professor McQueen on this as well, before we get into a couple other things before we transition into Matt's presentation. But I want to point out that so many good points and data points brought forth, and the fact that, George, brother, and correct me if I'm wrong, since we know that the mantle, and as you're pointing out, could absorb a great deal of heat, and since nobody knows the temperature of the mantle before the flood, then based on a few realistic and reasonable assumptions, we know that most of that heat left over from or after considering other mechanisms to remove the heat, such as hypercanes, the massive amount of water on the Earth at the time of the flood, supersonic steam jets taking much of the heat into space, of course, also the fact that all of this heat and energy would have helped produce all this coal, natural gas, and oil quickly. The leftover heat can easily be directed into the mantle, as you're pointing out, which means these calculations that people like Jordan have done, right? We have more than enough space to absorb that heat. Even after considering all of his calculations, we still have room for even more heat. George, what are your thoughts on that before we hand it to Professor McQueen?
Well, I agree. If I could play a short video, it's actually your own. It's a Standing for Truth video where Neff was debating Derek. I think Neff, it's only about a minute and a half long. I think Neff made a fantastic argument regarding the subduction plates, the cold subduction plates.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to open that up, and I'm going to go to the section of the video. Then I'm going to share the screen. And like I said, it's only a minute and a half. I think Neff made a fantastic argument with regards to that. So,
and here's a good point from Brother Wesley Coleman in the chat. He points out that NOAA says hurricanes, including weaker systems, help to regulate global temperatures and keep Earth as hospitable as possible, because there's so many different ways to mitigate the heat, right? And the fact that heat and energy are required in the first place are a good thing to even get the plates moving. And I find it so funny because the old Earth creationists or the atheists will say, you know, you young Earth creationists have no way to explain how it's even possible to get plates moving at meters per second. Or you guys have no way to explain all of this massive amount of coal, oil, and natural gas that exists on the planet. When in the same breath, they're trying to say that we have this unsolvable problem related to heat and energy, when the fact is the heat and energy helps us significantly answer these problems that they say we have. They are constantly arguing in circles, and they don't even realize their fallacious way of thinking. George, do you want to put the audio on, brother? George, you want to make sure when you share screen, click audio so we can hear. So maybe pause it, unshare, and then make sure to click the audio button on. But just make sure to click share audio when you... All right, George, we're all good, brother. If you want to share the screen for the audience, and then just make sure to click share audio on the bottom so we can hear the video. Are you there, George?
I'll comment while George is getting it ready that the equilibrium argument, the thermodynamic equilibrium argument about the blobs that George spoke of 20 minutes ago, very important. Let me give it back to George now.
As George is setting that up, I think he might have actually stepped away for a couple minutes. Professor McQueen, did you want to now take this thing to give
sorry, I can't find the audio, sharing audio.
Well, when you click share screen, George, okay, so you click share screen. At the very bottom left hand, you're going to see it's going to say share audio, and there's going to be a box that you have to click before you actually share the entire screen. You'll see it. It's in the middle box that pops up, brother.
All I get is share audio, yeah.
And then click the box. Make sure the box is clicked. And then share your screen after you click the box for share audio.
I don't get a box. I'm sorry, I don't get a box.
Well, I guess we don't get the video then.
Do you want to pull it up yourself, standing? I can give you the.
So are you saying George, that when you click share screen and you see the share audio, there's no there's no little box to click when next
there's no little box. No.
Are you on an iPad or something?
No, I'm on a Windows Explorer, or what's it called now? I think it's called something else.
Well, if you want to send me then via email the link and the exact timestamp, then I can play it. And in the meantime, we'll have Professor McQueen give his thoughts. Professor McQueen, take your time.
Okay, thank you very much. Once again, George, I compliment you, and this equilibrium argument that you gave about the blobs are very important. It's important to us at Standing for Truth that you understand that the information that George has uncovered in the last 2 weeks is very significant and very new. And we need to encourage those of you that have backgrounds in physics and engineering to work through some of these equations. I want the audience to understand that we can make things as simple as we can using Play-Doh and fancy glasses, with this being the outer core and this being the bottom of the crust, and this being a conduit that goes up. But once we give that kind of simple explanation, then we have to go to books like The Physics of the Earth, and we have to address these sorts of things. The differential equation I'm about to show you comes from a chapter that he entitles Creep and the Anelasticity of the Mantle. Now, if we were to break that apart into each part, it would itself be a 10-minute presentation about what a creep and so forth means in the context of the engineering or the rock mechanics. So let's emphasize the fact that the differential equation that I'm going to put up in a moment deals with the rate of dissipation of energy. The core of this heat problem that we've talked about is the argument. Those that are our critics say, oh, you can't have runaway plate tectonics, rapid plate tectonics like this little toy car where the plates move very quickly during the 1 year of the flood and then the centuries after the flood, because it generates too much heat. Well, the answer to that deals with this whole concept of what is the rate of the dissipation of that energy. Well, here's the foundation data that has been known since the late 60s about this value Q here. Q is a mathematical value ranging from 0 to 2000 that's used in geophysics. And the depth there, the D stands for depth in the mantle. Now you'll notice that it starts out quite low here, high in the mantle, but as you go down to the mantle's depth of 3,000 kilometers, it gets very high. Now, why would we get excited over a differential equation that looks like this? Now, many of you have probably had calculus, but here's a differential equation that dE over dt stands for the rate of dissipation of the energy. Now, remember from your calculus, if you talk about the first derivative of distance and time, that's speed. The second derivative is acceleration. So these are not such foreign ideas when you think about sports cars. So that dE over dQ involves the mathematical parameter Q, but also other things that you know, like pi is 3.14. And so E is energy. Then as you move over to the right to this part of the equation, you'll see that you get a number that's minus D mu E squared V divided by 2QR. Now, we're not going to take the time because tonight is not a course in calculus, but there are some of you that can screenshot this equation. And furthermore, you can screenshot this Australian professor's book here. He probably revised it since 1969. He was at University of Queensland, Stacey, and this book was published by John Wiley. And this is treated in great detail around page 215 in the book. What's my point? We are searching for truth. We are searching for answers. I'm optimistic that when we work through this calculus, when we work through the relationship between the elasticity of the mantle and the thermodynamics and put these things in balance, that we may find a very odd result. And that is the result that these connections or conduits or pipes that go from the blob up to the base of the mantle may work thermodynamically two ways. It may take things like kimberlite pipes and magmas and diamonds boom, up to the Earth's surface during the time of the flood. Or it may actually work the other way and be a heat sink. Now, wouldn't that be a great solution to that differential equation? But remember that one of the problems that many of us have brought up about the old Earth view of geology, whether it's metamorphic rocks or whether it's this issue of the blobs. See, I went back, George, and I looked at those papers you referred to, and I too couldn't figure out or couldn't find what the temperature was. Now, did I write this down? Did you say that some speculate that the blob might be 1,600 degrees? Or did I hear you wrong on that?
No, I made the assumption based around something that Neff produced on the cold subduction plates, where the difference in temperature was up to 1,650 degrees centigrade. So I then assumed if these blobs could actually be at 1,650 degrees centigrade. I don't know what it is because none of these reports actually say what the...
Yeah.
I don't know whether they know or they don't know, and they're not willing to actually disclose that information. But
you know, it's kind of like what you've argued, George, over the years. If the evolutionary community were to admit that carbon-14 can be found in diamonds, having a half-life of less than 5,000 years, and that the diamonds, let me find my chart. Yeah, there we go. That the diamonds have moved from the Mantle to the kimberlites of South Africa over 1 billion years. There should be no detectable carbon-14 in those diamonds.
now,
Yeah. What if these guys that wrote that paper, one of them with a 20-letter Russian name, I can't even pronounce the lady's name. What if these people actually did the math and said, oh no, what if our data actually support this crazy accelerated radioactive decay and accelerated plate tectonics idea of Dr. Baumgartner and the others that have written about this, Dr. Andrew Snelling? What if they realize that this is a deal breaker? And they say, well, for heaven's sakes, we're not going to publish this so that George and David can actually work the math themselves. Again, I'm speculating, but do you think, standing for truth, that our opponents in this argument are capable of deception?
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100%. Actually, George, before I pull up this video, because Brother McQueen brought up the radiocarbon and the fact that radiocarbon and carbon dating is actually a friend of the Young Earth Creationists, which I find hilarious that the critics and skeptics still bring up radiocarbon as a line of evidence for their position. I was wondering if we could now address real quick before we transition into the video and then Matt's presentation, Professor McQueen, while we have you here. This was a question from an old Earth skeptic who claimed that, or asked, why do fossils have different amounts of C14 dating them anywhere from 10,000 to 40,000 years when they were all buried at the same time in the same environment? And then the skeptic claims that we don't answer anything.
You know, it's just,
and which I find funny because we've got an entire playlist, Professor McQueen.
Well, let me make a brief comment before George and the Young Earth creation buddy there jump on this guy's back. So you're claiming that we answer nothing and claim everything. Well, let's look at this. Okay, are you admitting to us that fossils of T-Rex and fossils of let's say Cambrian trilobites, 600 million years old, are you admitting to us that we can find carbon-14 in these kind of fossils? Well, if that's the case, the range that anthropologists and archaeologists use carbon-14 to date something from 10,000 to 40,000 years, you've actually shot yourself in the foot the way George talks about so often, because you're admitting that these things are not millions of years old, billions of years old, but are thousands of years old. So who is it actually, Smoky Saint, that's answering nothing and claiming everything?
I've got a bit to add on to that, if I can share the screen now. Or do you want to play the video first?
No.
Let's deal with this
deal
first.
With this comment first,
Okay.
And say everything that we need to say to that. And yeah, go ahead, brother, if you wanted to share screen.
Now I see the share audio button. Okay, I got it. All right, can you see that standing?
Yes.
Okay, this is in the 12th Nobel Symposium proceedings. Okay, there's the references there. It's the carbon-14 dating and Egyptian chronology proceedings of the 12th Nobel Symposium. This is the admission. Okay, it says, quote, if a 14C date supports our theories, we'll put it in our main text. If it does not entirely contradict them, we'll put it in the footnote. And if it's completely out of date, well, we just drop it. End of quote. Now go further.
Amazing. Amazing.
I'll just explain why we find carbon dates that don't relate to the 14,000 year date, right? So you got to understand, when they do carbon-14 dating, they don't actually measure. They actually measure the ratio of C14 to C12, right? So less carbon-14 in a sample will calculate to an older age. Now, some carbon-14 gets lost during fossilization from exposure to water, and that's been shown. It's soluble, it can move around. Also, keep in mind that I think Professor McQueen stated this about the magnetic field of the Earth. There was a stronger magnetic field in the past, which means there would have been less C14 produced. Okay, so since C14 is forming faster than it's decaying, it's impossible to know the past ratio and get an accurate age calculation by carbon-14 dating. Now, we keep hearing this about you can't use carbon-14 dating for greater than 40, 50,000 years, but their own literature, the AMS literature, shows that it can measure up to 90,000 years. Now, just to give you an indication, I think we've spoken about volcanoes in the past, but volcanoes actually spew out a lot of carbon dioxide. And I'll just quote some stuff out of this paper. It's a phys.org paper. You'll see there, scientists presently use wiggle match dating as the method of choice for eruption dating, but the technique is not valid if carbon dioxide gas from the volcano is affecting a tree's version of the wiggle. Then it says the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12, that's the two stable isotopes of carbon in the modern water of, say, Lake Tapu and Wakaku River, tells us that volcanic carbon dioxide is getting into the groundwater from the underlying magma body. So you can see there's contamination involved through the soil, and the trees actually can absorb that carbon dioxide, that additional carbon dioxide from the volcanoes, which will give you an incorrect reading. Okay, that's my reply to that. Maybe Matt might have something else.
Yeah, let me put the comment back on screen in case Matt also had some thoughts. And Professor McQueen.
Matt, go ahead. George and I have done too much talking. We've got to hear.
Yeah, that's right. It's your turn, Matt.
Okay, all right, no problem. Well, if we're going to go with the carbon dating, we find that it has about an 18% accuracy. The farther we go back in time, the less accurate it becomes, especially after a few thousand years. And the reason this is because in our model, there's massive volcanism occurring. And the same thing can be said that when they take carbon dating back, they start to find discrepancies in things because they also have the same problem that we have. They just don't acknowledge it. So what's going on is when they've taken samples from things that are a few thousand years old, they send them into different laboratories, they get different results. So therefore, it's not exactly extremely reliable when we go far. But what happens is if we go back, a few hundred years, it's very reliable. So therefore, they trust that it's reliable going extremely far back, as he says, maybe to 40,000 years. But what he's probably getting at is how come there's 40,000 years showing up whatsoever? Just because something has the potential to exist as far as half-life doesn't mean it does go back that far. So get that way of thinking out of your mind, because it's the same way that we see with the Proton 21 laboratory results, right? They're creating these radioactive elements right in front of their eyes that test billions of years old. So obviously they didn't come from billions of years old. They were made just the other day. So we have to take these things with a grain of salt. And for example, when they test the Shroud of Turin, what happened? They didn't get results that lined up exactly with what happened at the time of Christ. So what they did is they said, well, it must be a forgery. Well, what happened is the shroud went through a fire at one time. It was in a church that burned down. What happens in fires? Carbon dating is completely thrown off. So again, you have to expect that there's some discrepancies going on here. And carbon dating is one of those things that has a big margin of error in it. So also, same thing. Why would we find carbon in dinosaurs if they were very old? They're going to say that they could have flushed from the upper layers down into the bones themselves. But you also have a problem with finding it in zircon crystals. Zircon crystals are supposed to date back to the beginning of the universe, right? Billions of years old. But there we find carbon as well. So 18% here, yes.
YEC, did I hear you say that there's a routine 18% error?
No,
carbon 14.
I'm sorry. There's only an 18% accuracy.
Oh, accuracy. Okay.
If I said it was my bad.
Now, students, I want to make sure you're taking notes too. So it's 18% accuracy. Okay, back to you, YEC.
That means it's an 82% failure rate on a study where they sent it to 100 different laboratories. I have a video on it as well. I don't know if it's specifically carbon dating, but it should be. Matter of fact, after this, I will release that. And another thing is you were wondering how the heat could be mitigated down into the earth to these balls that you're talking about that are inside the under the crust of the earth. Yes. There's a video that I was looking for while you were talking. It's deep in my history. That's the only problem why I could not find it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hunt that down for you. So the next time you give your presentation, I'm going to show you how they actually are able to move things in opposite directions. Matter of fact, what's fascinating is they put this little tiny stick that's basically like a shape. That's all it is. It's like it would be like when you're a kid and you see those red straws and they twist, and you little kids like drinking out of them because the water spins in a huge circle before it finally gets to their mouth. And yeah, it's a curly straw. Basically, picture a curly fry when you go to a restaurant, but like a slinky. It looks just like that, yeah. And they put that in water, and then they pour a hose on it, and it follows the water all the way up the hose and inside of it. So it's a video called something levity. So very interesting that it's able to pull it in a direction. Matter of fact, if you've ever watched Ancient Aliens, they're talking about one of the videos that they're talking about is an invention that the Germans used. And they didn't have a propeller on the front of their plane. They actually had something that pulled the plane through the sky. And it used a very weird shape and pattern like that. Incredible invention. But it's just in a history museum now. They don't use it. But anyway, I digress. That was not part of the question.
And I would like to make one point too, real quick, on the carbon dating and the fact that carbon dating is a friend of Young Earth Creationists. Well, the further you go back, and correct me if I'm wrong, Professor McQueen, but if you go back beyond a few thousand years, you're going to get a lot older ages than the true ages, because carbon dating tends to give ages that are far too old anyways, especially the closer you get back to the flood. Right? If we were to dig something up that was buried in the flood, if we dated it, you would get something like 50,000 years instead of 5,000 years, right? But the point is, you never get dates consistent with deep time evolution. We find detectable levels of carbon in what? Dinosaur bones. We find it in diamonds. We find it in coal. We find it in samples that the evolutionists say are millions to billions of years old. And another thing, yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that what George has spent so much time working on, this whole issue of carbon-14 in diamonds. For those of you that want to study this, remember this goes all the way back to the RATE program, RATE program, in the year 2000. when the scientists there during that ICR initiative discovered, to their amazement, actually, carbon-14 in diamonds. We've got to hammer this over and over again, George, like hammering nails into a wall that we're building, because this is enormously significant. If the evolutionary community would acknowledge on a National Geographic special that diamonds supposedly coming up from the Mantle in South Africa and are supposed to be 1 billion years old, let's say they're 500 million years old. If there's detectable carbon-14 in it, then this destroys the old Earth model.
Yep.
It's absolutely a devastating bit of information. Should we get the evolutionary community? Let me read, what are they saying here? Pretty technical. I'm not good at calculus. But is the solution that the heat went down from the surface? Well, that's what we're working on. And YEC just commented that in his experience, there's actually some math that shows that this tube of paper towels here, if this is a conduit, maybe the heat went up in the case of the explosion of the kimberlite, but maybe what George has introduced us to with these blobs is that maybe the heat of rapid plate tectonics can be taken down 3,000 kilometers into the blob. You think that might be viable, gentlemen?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that was a good question in the audience, because I understand that this presentation has been very technical. So if you have any questions like that, feel free to, as you have done, ask here and also email me. For anybody that's joined, we've still maintained roughly 60 people the entire hour and a half. We've had a lot of new people join. So real quick, anybody who has recently joined, the first half an hour, definitely check out. We've laid down the foundation, absolutely demolishing the idea that the scriptures teach a local flood. And then we had a fantastic presentation from Professor McQueen and George, and now we are addressing some skeptics' claims on carbon dating, for example. So Professor McQueen, I wanted to ask you, while we have you still, since the existence of radiocarbon in diamonds, dinosaur fossils, for example, so on and so forth, is pretty well just a fatal blow to old Earth in deep time, I'd like to leave no stone unturned, because I haven't seen any good response from them. So if this was their response, Professor McQueen, what would be the best way for us to counter it? So Crimson Air says, some old Earth creationists suggest that the C14 in diamonds may be a byproduct of the carbon structure itself. Has C14 ever been found in non-carbon materials such as sapphire and quartz?
Okay, let me go with quartz here, because this is beach sand. This is what windows are made of. This is the chemistry of silicon dioxide. Now you'll notice that there is no carbon in that equation. There's silicon and oxygen. But now let's go to one of my areas of specialty, and that is crystallography. And quartz is a hexagonal crystal that, if you look at it at the end, it looks like this: hexagon, 6 sides, octagon, 8 sides. So this is a hexagonal. But if we take this into 3 dimensions here, and we draw a hexagonal crystal in 3 dimensions here, and look at the crystal structure where I've drawn the circle around it there, inside that crystal structure are what are called fluid inclusions. Now, these are inclusions of water inside a quartz crystal. For 20 years, I was an assistant scoutmaster. Sometimes the Boy Scouts would be in a quartz-rich area, and these fools would throw the quartz crystal into the fire. Well, it would heat up these fluid inclusions, and then it would blow up the quartz crystals like shrapnel. We've got to go back to their moms and dads and explain to them, why they're cut from exploding rocks. So it's a real problem. But inside the quartz crystal are these things called fluid inclusions. And some of these fluid inclusions, here's a blow up of one, does include water, but it also includes salty water, and it includes some crystals like carbonate, CaCO3. So the answer to the question is, by the time ICR spent the money to find the carbon-14 in diamonds, nobody has set aside enough money to look at sapphires and quartz. Literally, the Lord Jesus only knows what we might find in those other minerals.
Even more evidence for the young earth creation position. So George, I know you want to play a clip, but I just want to recap a couple things that I find it funny that over the course of the last hour and 45 minutes, we've not only dealt with the heat problem, I think, in a way that looks promising for future research, but also providing numerous lines of evidence that is so contradictory to the old earth creation model that it actually precludes old earth creation, as in they have no real answer for these types of problems, especially pertaining to radiocarbon. So I find it funny when they want to go back to this so-called heat problem, but it's they themselves that don't want to deal with the multitude of lines of evidence that really just ruins their position. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And George, brother, I know that you wanted to play that video, or how did you want to proceed, George?
Why don't you play the video before YEC begins his part?
Let's do it. George, did you want to play it now that you know how to share the audio, or do you want me to?
No, go ahead. I'll do it another time. You've got it.
Okay. So let me share the video. You just, you want me to go 2 minutes of you want to play 2 minutes of this video?
Well, I think I've got the timestamp there from about 27 minutes to about 29. So yeah, around about 2 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, here we go, gentlemen. I'm going to mute myself so we can hear the video.
The baseball, that's where God split the crust of the earth and the water came forth to flood the earth. Evolutionists claim there's a cycle where crustal material goes down into the earth by runaway subduction, and it comes back up as hot material, as plumes of volcanic material. But there is no cycle. All we have is evidence that plumes do rise, but not anywhere near the rate necessary to equal the amount of material that's been subducted. So why? Is because the subduction was caused by rapid plate movement during the flood, but there is no cycle where it goes down and comes back up again. That's a myth. This science paper shows a slab of material going deep into the crust of the earth, way down below the crust, into the outer core, to the outer core of the earth. The temperature difference stated by this scientific paper is 1260 degrees difference. Further studies that have been conducted since this paper was published show it's more like 3,000 degree difference. Now, that's impossible, because if that material went down into the earth to the depth of the outer core of the earth at the rate your fingernails grow, which is what they are moving today, that's uniformitarianism, it would have heated up to the temperature of the material around it as it went down. It's impossible for that material to be 3,000 degrees cooler than the material around it if it's been down there 250 million years. It's impossible. So how did it get there? It got there fast during the flood of Noah. It got there very fast in a matter of months. These are a few of the numerous scientific studies published in the Science Journal, 7 every year are published, which show that water is formed form strata in groups rapidly.
That'll do.
The strata in a mountain. The strata going off to the
So yeah, that was very good. And this is a line of evidence that I have been bringing forth for 2 years of debates, because it's the evolutionist and uniformitarian that always says creationists don't make testable predictions. Well, we have made it a mission almost in this channel to show that no, it's actually creationists that are the ones doing the gold standard of science and making testable predictions. So this, I challenge the old earth creationists, the atheists, because they've yet to provide an answer. We did a full, as you know, George, a couple-hour rebuttal to Guts and Gibbon on dating methods, probably about 5 months ago now. There was never a response. We actually played her video word for word and kind of demolished her talking points that she's still repeating.
Well, you guys continue to excite me about this. This is a very good argument I had not heard. The very idea, it goes back to what George commented about earlier about the issue of equilibrium. You've got a 3,000 degree object, magma.
Neff was talking about Fahrenheit, degrees Fahrenheit. I converted that 3,000 to centigrade, which is 1,650 degrees centigrade. So that's if you're wondering the contradiction, that's why, because
at any rate,
he was talking Fahrenheit.
Okay, very good point. But I don't want to lose the forest for the trees here. The very idea, you got this 3,000 degree Fahrenheit thing going down into a mantle. Why is it not in equilibrium? Can you see how many of our arguments that George and I and YEC have presented revolve around this idea of equilibrium versus disequilibrium?
Amen.
And for those of you that are not familiar with this vocabulary, if you have an air-conditioned room and then you open the door to the outside, that's what is meant by disequilibrium. You got this extremely hot air on the outside, and then you open the door and you've got your cool air.
Right.
It's going to flow out to the outside according to the second law, I guess, of thermodynamics. It's got to. And so this is, this screen that you got up here, Earth's flowing mantle. Exactly right. Gentlemen, I have run out of steam, and I will bid you all good night. I look forward to listening to the last bit of this. YEC, I will send you an email after you speak your piece. Good night, gentlemen. Can you drop my video now?
Absolutely.
Good night, David.
Absolutely. God bless Professor McQueen. As always, it's a pleasure. And so many great points in a fantastic presentation. To the audience, we're having Professor McQueen back here again, as we do weekly, next Monday on flood geology in the Grand Canyon. That was actually supposed to be today, but we thought this is an important issue to tackle, and we had so many new findings and data points we wanted to
YEC, I will communicate with you otherwise. Good night, gentlemen. I am leaving the room.
God bless you, Professor McQueen. So
thank you, brothers.
I want to point this out before we
I'd like to hear more from Matt. I think he's got more to say, though.
Yes, actually, Matt's going to be giving his. We're now moving in a minute to Matt's presentation now, but I want to just make one comment on this, that we still challenge the evolutionists over and over again, and you've got people like James Downard who check out Matt's latest community post on him and Jackson Wheat. Jackson Wheat, he's been forced into retirement months ago, and he's a smart guy to not really pop his head up much anymore, actually. Poor guy. But people like James Downard, we've debated all of these members of Team Dodgeball, and we present these arguments. I've recently presented these arguments as well to some old Earth creationist Christians, right? And no answer, of course. So once again, I just want to make the challenge again, just to show that there are very plausible solutions to the heat problem, but it's them that ignore the data that contradicts their model. And as we can see here, Dr. John Baumgartner, a geophysicist, he predicted testable predictions. He predicted that scientists might find crust that cycled through the Earth's mantle during Noah's flood, right? Due to runaway subduction. We hold to a model that suggests when the fountains of the Great Deep broke forth, the Earth was fractured like an eggshell. We've got plates moving horizontally, vertically. These plates are moving at meters per second, because the snail pace movements that we see today, these uniformitarian processes and movements of the plate today, can't explain the geological features of the Earth. And we always make the comparison that you've got two cars coming at each other. If you got them coming at each other at 1 kilometer an hour, there's not going to be much going on in terms of damage or buckling. But if you got two cars coming at each other at 100 kilometers an hour, Okay, you're going to have a lot of damage, a lot of buckling, in the same way that you got two plates colliding into each other at meters per second movements through the floodwaters. This is where we have the necessary conditions to buckle the strata and rapidly uplift them to explain a lot of these geological features of the Earth. So, and George, I know you're going to say something. Let me just finish this before I forget, because a lot of this is just at the top of my head, because it's such an important topic that the prediction was then made. If this is true, then we should find crust cycling through Earth's mantle to demonstrate this. And years later, look, 10 years later, they found just this. So I want to read this part and then hand it to you, George. Because the cold pre-flood ocean floor sank about 4,500 years ago, and it would take many millions of years to melt, right? Colder material should still be sitting at the base of the mantle. Think of it like an ice cube in your hot coffee. It'd still be there after a few seconds, but gone hours later. Not long after, in 1987, geologists discovered evidence that supports both conclusions. Although the mantle is very hot, okay, up to 7,200 degrees, geologists found slabs of material at the bottom of the mantle that are cooler than the surrounding rocks by as much as 5,400 degrees Fahrenheit. Old Earth creationists, theistic evolutionists, atheists, explain away this data. How do you explain this according to your model? If these plates were subducted, or this material was subducted millions of years ago, they should have at least melted or warmed up to the surrounding rocks. This discovery presents two mountainous puzzles for evolutionary geologists. First, the 420-mile deep barrier seems to prevent plates from getting down to the bottom of the mantle. Second, even if plates could push through the barrier at their present rate of 1 to 2 inches per year, they would melt and match the rest of the mantle's temperature. But the findings fit nicely with Baumgartner's catastrophic flood model. Now, here's the thing. This is the last thing I'm going to say. The best thing your evolutionists like Team Dodgeball could put forth is what's called a rescue device. Or simply, because they don't question the bigger picture, they're going to somehow force fit this into their model, okay? But here's what they are missing, is the fact that this was a confirmed testable prediction. As you can see, it was confirmed 10 years after the prediction was made. That's the gold standard of science. Anything that they can put forth is simply something that which is force fitted into the model that contradicts their model. Anyways, I yield. Go ahead, Brother George.
I'll just let the phone stop ringing for a second.
As you do that, then.
Okay,
so
I've got it. I was just going to add, Standing, this issue is not about one science. There need to be a number of science disciplines involved. As I mentioned with the limestone, it's not about geology, just geology, or chemistry. It's both. It's the same thing with the heat problem. It's not a thermodynamics question. It's also geology, a physics, and a chemistry. And how many times have we heard, I don't like mentioning names, but that particular nuclear engineer say, oh, whenever you present geological evidence, oh, I'm not a geologist.
Right.
I can't comment. This is the problem, you see. It involves numerous science disciplines. That's why it has to be looked at in combination with all those disciplines rather than one individual thing like the thermodynamics. I'll hand it over to Matt now. He can do his 20 minutes or so.
Amen. Amen. Brother Matt, you've been sitting back patiently. You've made some great comments. And we now hit the 2-hour mark, and we are ready for your the grand finale of the night, brother. Mattman, take it home for us, my good man.
All right. One question was that you said the critics keep saying is, I can't answer that. I'm not a geologist. Well, how come they can throw critical questions at you that are geology? If you're going to say I can't answer any of them, then you obviously know enough to say I have a question about it and you have a problem with it. It doesn't make much sense, does it? I mean, you can. It's just more double standard to me. Sounds like. I saw a super chat. Did you want to read that?
Yeah. Let's go through some of these super chats, guys. Thanks so much. We've had a great chat tonight. Been a ton of fun. Dirt Bike Repair says, keep them coming. SFT 100% on it, brother. I appreciate it. As we've said before, George, Matt, and I, we have tons of projects and shows planned for you in the future. Alec Cox says, thank you at Standing for Truth and David McQueen for dismantling, and I agree, it's been dismantled, dismantling the mantle problem of heat that the dopes try to make a big deal. And Alec, don't address the problems that are actually a huge deal for their model. He says there are massive ice clumps in the Earth's mantle. So yeah, as we went over, we have massive slabs of cool rock that shouldn't be there if deep time evolution were true. And then there's another super chat that just came in here. Brother Brandon, we appreciate it. $50 super chat, Team SFT for the win. Amen, amen. And I will say this, anybody who is an old earther or an atheist or whatever, and we're actually in the middle of setting up a big debate with Professor McQueen on geology with somebody from Reasons to Believe. So fingers crossed that we negotiate the details and get that going. But that being said, Professor McQueen's our team geologist who's worked in the field for many, many years, okay? Any skeptics think that they can actually defend the science of uniformitarianism and debunk the flood, you let us know and we'll set up a cordial debate. We've hosted now roughly 110 debates. You can bet yourself it's going to be moderated and as neutrally as possible and in a respectful manner. So that being said, anybody ever wants to kind of step up and debate that topic with our team geologist, feel free to let me know. One Cow Stampede says, thanks guys, great work. God bless you all. I really, really appreciate you, the support. So Luca says, sign me in. So yeah, Luca, if you and Luca and McQueen would be, Professor McQueen would be a fantastic discussion. And he's, that would be a geology based discussion. So Smokey's always up for a debate. Probably best to do a little study on geology before you debate a professional geologist. It would be my recommendation. But so that being said, we've got a lot of super chats. I appreciate it. Because I mean, nothing. See, here's the thing. We've actually had numerous people who have kind of been willing to debate Professor McQueen, but we're looking for like an evenly matched opponent, because it won't be much fun to debate a young Earth creationist geologist. And for every single challenge, their response is what? I'm not a geologist. I'm not a geologist. I'm not a geneticist. I'm not a geneticist. So, so we're just holding out for, but like I said, we've got a really, another fellow geologist that we're working on setting up with Professor McQueen. That being said, I know that was long-winded. Thanks so much, everybody in the side chat, for the epic support. You guys are the life and blood of this channel. So go ahead, Brother Matt.
All right, everyone. I'm going to be talking for maybe about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to share the math because everybody likes the numbers. So we're going to go over a few different things. But first, I would like to let everybody know, and so they can acknowledge that there are multiple different flood models, and some of them have more of a heat problem than others. And so when we're talking about the heat problem, usually they're referring to two different things. They could be referring to catastrophic plate tectonics, which has tectonic sprint, moving of the continents by friction, and they also have accelerated nuclear decay. That's where the heat comes from with that model. With the hydroplate theory, they have the heat being generated a lot from the production of radioactive elements through a process called Z-pinch, and from the very continent itself dropping down about, I don't know, like a mile, slamming down and ejecting supercritical water into the atmosphere. So both have different forms of heat production, some greater than others. So when we're going to be trying to answer where did the heat go, we have to really define, well, what model? I mean, we can talk about the different models, or we can just kind of lump them all together, or we can identify each one and give an answer to each one. So that's what I'm going to try to intend to do by mixing them together as much as I can. And I don't know how well I've done with this, but I'm going to try my best. So I've got some visuals ready to go for everybody. That way, you know how I like visuals. I think people probably learn better this way. So let me find them. People can get. I guess I should start out first by saying, when we're talking about hydroplate theory, Walt Brown himself is the man behind it. Now, he considered radioactive elements to be bad. But there's things that are good and there's things that are bad. He considered them bad, so therefore God would have not made them until after the fall. Because he believed, well, you know what, I'll get into that later, but that's his perspective, and that's what he believed, and that's why it's in the model, and that's why before the flood he did not believe any radioactive particles even existed at all in the environment. So now we can move on. Don't know why I went off on that tangent, but you have it anyway. So Erica herself finds the best questions, honestly. So one of her questions was, why do rocks get dated older the farther away they get from the mid-Atlantic ridge? And you can see this is true. This is from Geology right here, organization. And how can this be true with the hydroplate model? She didn't exactly say that, but that's what she's getting at, because that's the model that we talk about the most or defend the most. Well, I'll explain it for everybody first, then I'll answer it in 3 different ways. One, I'm going to show and explain it from their view, then how to answer it from the hydroplate theory perspective, and then an overview of what I personally think. So evolution tells us in deep time that basically time is required for this process because it's uniformitarianism. Because when we look today at the mid-Atlantic ridge that's moving, it moves but very slowly, like at a fingernail growth rate. Thus, for the continents to be where they are today, it must have taken eons. This is uniformitarianism. We believe in catastrophism, so the process happened very quickly. It's a very different theory. That's all. So what basically, these are divergent plates is what we're talking about. So they believe that the rocks are older the farther they get away. And they believe this because the farther you move from the ridge, when they test these radioactive elements, they show that they're older. So what's going on here? There is a problem with that way of thinking. They also believe that Earth's core, well, here, this is divergent plates for you. It's basically the plates are moving away from each other at this area of the mid-Atlantic ridge. So if you can see a visual, this is what's going on. The magma is flowing up, hitting the plates and pushing them away from each other. And as it's doing that, this is that snail-paced movement that you can see is happening from the convection. Basically, the core pushes things out away from it. And by doing so, the plates are moving away. And so this is the uniformitarianism thing. So this is essentially what evolution believes, is that Earth's core is powered by uranium. And since there's so much pressure inside the Earth that it's always pushing lava out, this uranium, which would be the oldest on Earth, being the deepest, would come up with the lava, therefore bringing the oldest and deeper uranium with it. Therefore, they should find the opposite conclusion with the oldest rocks dated at closer to the mid-Atlantic ridge. That is, unless they want to deny that uranium is deep within the core and near the mantle, but that's what they believe is actually powering the core. So riddle me that. It seems very contradictory, doesn't it, to me, that their model is, or they're saying our model is wrong when it's actually theirs that contradicts what they're telling us. So we say that the Earth was at one time a single continent, and then the fountains of the Great Deep broke forth and opened, and this water started covering the continents. Now, regardless if we go with the catastrophic plate tectonics or the hydroplate theory that brought new super heavy elements in that were either created during the flood or already existing radioactive elements, regardless, they got dumped into the ocean or reshuffled in the ocean during this flood process. So it doesn't really matter which model we're going to talk about. So I'm hoping I can talk and describe both scenarios. But now if we go to the hydroplate theory, when the water was coming up at this mid-Atlantic ridge, which you can see here, the continents were connected, remember. So this ridge would have actually not even been, all that distance between the continents wasn't even there yet. So it split actual land in half. So if we go with a hydroplate theory, then these super heavy elements got released, and then they began to cool down and stabilize into the radioactive elements that we now know. As the flood waters eventually covered the dry land, they would now be there would now be nothing but ocean left, right? All the land was covered. But beneath the ocean, all of the continents are still moving away from this mid-Atlantic ridge over the process of 1 year. But remember, as this is starting, these super heavy elements are now all decaying. They're creating the elements and are reshuffling these radioactive elements if we're going with catastrophic plate tectonics. So as they settle, the geologic column begins to form. That's what we know as the geologic column today. We see it and view it similar to this. Down at the basement might be the Precambrian, but this would be basement level rock. All of the other layers are basically reshuffled around during the flood. But this is when radioactive elements were distributed the most, when all of the land was covered and the ocean was flowing all over the continents. So basically, sorry, what was this on there? Oh, not for me, okay. And basically, like all of the elements, heavy atomic elements would be deeper. So I made a chart for everybody, which you can see right here. So if uranium, this is a question for everybody to use logic and think and answer it for themselves. If uranium is the heaviest and has the most atomic weight, and it dates the oldest, is there any surprise that it's found in the deepest layers of rock? It shouldn't be. So what would happen now? What would happen if there was a flood and it was reshuffling things based on atomic mass? Well, think about it from this perspective. Where are most of the radioactive elements today? 90% of them are in the crust, contrary to where they should be if evolution was true. And if you look at this chart, you can see uranium, which dates the oldest, is at the bottom, followed by thorium, and you can go up the list all the way. Look, there's radon, there's potassium, there's argon, all these different dating methods. And what do we find? The higher you get, the younger the age range is, and the higher they're found. So it should be no surprise that uranium in the deeper ones dates deeper because it's heavier and it went down deeper. It's not because it's older, it's because it weighs more. So real simple. We've already seen these elements form from the Proton 21 laboratories, so it's no mystery that they're dating old, even if they just formed. Or if you don't want to believe they were just formed during the flood, that's fine as well, because they could have been made during creation week. Now we'll come back to that. But as the land cools faster than water as well. So remember this. This is because water has a high specific heat capacity. In other words, it absorbs a huge amount of heat energy to increase the comparatively small amount of temperature. So therefore, is it any surprise that the elements that are on the dry land would date younger than they would be in the ocean? Of course not, especially with uranium sinking deeper. So of course the rocks and everything that's deeper in the deeper ocean would be older. It's just logic. Now think about it like this. The land that now exists at the mid-Atlantic ridge was not there at the flood. That's obvious. So of course it dates younger because radioactive elements have to flow over to that region with water currents. Think about that. So if it wasn't there and these radioactive elements were being moved about in a global flood and settling, and as the land masses are forming and the continental crust is going up and mountains are forming, all these radioactive elements are right here on the dry land on the crust, and they're flowing down based on their weight, and they get settled. They get settled in the crust, and then what happens is the floodwaters eventually wash away. The remaining land in the ocean, and then what do we find? We find that this is the major distribution of the radioactive elements, all during that process. Of course, there's been some change since then, but that better explains the distribution of what we see. So in conclusion, we see exactly what we should see if we released radioactive elements all at the same time into a planet that was submerged in water and then formed land masses. Heavier elements would sink, the deeper and the lighter elements would be near the top. It just so happens that the heavier and radioactive elements do date older, thus giving the impression that these rocks with radioactive elements in them are older than the ones above them. I guarantee you, if uranium dated younger than thorium, but they found it deeper, there would be another theory based around that to prove that it's old anyway. It doesn't really matter. So it just happens to be that this is the case. So since we know that the Proton 21 laboratories, that these radioactive elements form, then rapidly decay, based mostly on temperature, but that they test billions or millions of years old, depending on the element that's tested, of course, yet they formed just days prior, then the reality is all of this argument is a moot point anyway, because it wouldn't matter if they dated 1 month old or 1 trillion billion years old, because we literally watched them be created days before. So really, we're just arguing over nothing at this point when it comes to that. So do these radioactive elements need to have formed during this time when Walt Brown theorizes? I say no, because clearly they could have been made during creation week. It's only Walt Brown who says no, that they couldn't have been made then. We're apologists. Our entire team are. We like to defend young Earth creation and the young Earth creation models. Even if we don't even agree with them, we like to study them all and learn about them and somewhat defend them. I do this, for example, with Dr. Jensen's work all the time, even though I don't even agree with his own timeline. So riddle me that. It's just what we should do, and I think that the critics would do good too in critiquing all the different models. We can also like other models or even create our own. There's no reason we can't do this. I love to do that myself. So as I stated when I started, and I started to bring that back up, Walt Brown personally views radioactive elements as bad. Thus, God would not have made them during creation week for that reason. This is his personal view that he came up with and implemented into his own model. He said it must have happened after Adam's fall. Thus, he made a model showing them not there during creation and being made during the flood. I think they were made during creation week because we can find, one, we know that there's certain elements that our body does require. Potassium is one of these in every single cell. So if it wasn't there, what did Adam do? I have no idea. Also, another thing would be that he thought these elements would be harmful in foods, and thus animals and humans would not be able to tolerate them. But this falls short today because of what we actually know about radioactive elements that are in food. That's not happening to anybody. Nobody dies because of radioactive toxicity, even when we eat high amounts of bananas. You know, there's a group of people called 30 bananas a day, where they literally live on their base calories of bananas. They have for a very, very long time. So if we take bananas, for example, they have high amounts of radiation inside of them. If you go to an airport, they actually set off the alarms at airports because of how high of amount they actually have of potassium-40. Yet it's impossible for them to harm us because it's water soluble. We just get rid of it. It means nothing. There's no toxicity level that we can consume that would be harmful to us. So therefore, I believe Walt Brown was wrong in that theory of thinking, oh, these must all be bad, therefore God would have never made them. I personally believe that was wrong. So I think they were probably made during creation week. It just makes more sense to me.
So with this, Matt, real quick, and I'm sorry to interrupt because you're making so many good points, brother. And really, I'm just loving this stream because so far it's been 2 hours of 15 minutes of just addressing all their best so-called questions. So great point. Is this similar to the fact that, let's say, obviously God created, as we know from the Bible, he created a functionally mature universe, right? That's the only way it could work, especially with all the hundreds and hundreds of symbiotic relationships that we could point out. If God instantly created trees and then we came along, Matt, and we analyzed, let's say, the leaves, we would then detect chlorophyll as we can detect today in leaves, right? So is it the same thing then if we took some rocks an hour after the creation event, right? And we measured them for, let's say, uranium and lead. If we found lead, would it then be a wrong assumption to say, well, this lead must have been derived from the processes of uranium to lead, when in fact they were just created in the first rocks in the same way that Adam and Eve would have been created with genetic differences, right? And as I pointed out, leaves on trees would be created with chlorophyll. Is that kind of more or less, would that be valid? Go ahead, brother.
Yeah, that would be a great explanation. Most of the science that we have now goes back to the flood. So that's what we deal with mostly. When we go back to creation, everything gets a little bit iffy anyway. And since it can't be done, we don't really mess with it too much. But yeah, I mean, if God created animals, but didn't create plants and trees fully grown and mature, and they would have no food supply. So there would have had to have been something for them to eat, just like Adam. If he was told to eat from the fruit of the trees, but God put him in a garden with no fruit trees except for little seeds, they're in some deep trouble. So if Adam were to cut down a tree, he could essentially use dendrochronology, which would be counting of the tree rings. Obviously, he couldn't use carbon dating or the other mallow, but he could essentially count the tree rings, and even he would be like, wow, that tree is really old. I thought this was made yesterday. So yeah, exactly. I mean, there has to be something going on here that's spiritual. And obviously when there's a creation and it tells us that Adam was placed into a garden, but he was made just a couple days after plants, well, what's going on here? Obviously there was something created specifically in their mature state. So there's no problem with saying that some elements already existed. God can't make rocks without elements. I mean, the earth is made out of elements. You can't have earth without elements. So how were they dated? Well, yeah, there would have to be some kind of date. If dating methods even existed, I'm sure, just like Adam looking up at the star would have seen starlight, he would have assumed that it took that star how long to get here. So again, if Adam was a scientist, he would be trying to date the age of the earth with what we know about modern day science, and he would have deduced old earth based on that himself.
Right,
So
right.
we have to be careful. We have to go, okay, well, that's why we like to go back to the flood. That's what we can do, because that's where the genetics go.
And that's where we can make some testable predictions as well. So technically, if we were to take that rock at creation and assume the lead was the result of decay from uranium, we would then be inappropriately dating the rock, because why shouldn't there be lead in them? In the same way that if we tested the genetics of Adam and Eve and the biblical kinds, and we constantly point out that why would God create homogeneous first organisms to what? Produce clones? Of course, he's going to front load DNA differences. Now, the evolutionists would look to those DNA differences at creation, and through genetic sequencing technologies, they would say, oh, look, these differences must have been inherited from past common ancestors. No, there were no past common ancestors. Adam and Eve reflect pre-existing DNA differences in the same way that these original rocks would reflect the pre-existing elements. And I think really both, and that's why it's a problem for the old earth creationists, is they have to, and correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, if you agree with this, the old earth creationists have to approach this differently than the atheists. The atheists reject miracles. The atheists reject the supernatural. The old earth creationists at least says that they start from the Bible. So if they start from the Bible, why would they reject miracles? Why would they reject the obvious fact that God would have front-loaded Adam and Eve with pre-existing DNA differences? Even the old earth creationists would agree with this, but then they don't apply that same logic to other things like trees, like leaves, like rocks.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, brother.
Oh yeah, I know what you mean. I actually found out from Jesse today. This goes to show you how little I know about old Earth creation. Is they actually don't believe in dinosaurs. They said one of the things is they believe in a local flood. They don't believe in dinosaurs. And there was one other thing. I was like, wow, I was unaware of this.
Well, old Earth creationists do believe dinosaurs existed.
Oh, good. That's a bizarre one.
Of course they do, but
okay.
They would just say that dinosaurs, and so their position, a lot of them, is that and that's at the beginning of my presentation. That's why I pointed out that the old earth creationists want to accept, right, what they think is accepting. They want to believe in the geological history of the earth, right? They're going to just kind of believe what the seculars say about the different layers in the geological record, and where the dinosaurs fit, of course, and where all the different organisms fit, and then believe the pre-Cambrian and Cambrian. I mean, we can easily demolish the fact that there is a geological column, but they believe at some point God would have created special organisms, eventually created Adam and Eve. But they're not dinosaur deniers. No, that's definitely not the old earthers. Let me put this up on screen, brother, and see. Here's a question based on your presentation if you wanted to give an answer. Question from Smokey Say, I appreciate the super chat, says, why are rocks closer to the ridge dated younger by many years than the ones further away from the ridge if all the rocks were formed at the same time?
Because there was the reshuffling during the flood. So picture you have like an aquarium, and you have a salt and pepper shaker, and you dump all the elements inside. And now all of a sudden, you take that aquarium and you fill it with water and you shake it up. essentially, yeah, it's not exactly like that, but that's essentially what was happening during the flood. Now you got to remember the ridge itself is where the water was coming out. So if this ridge has water flowing out of it, and it's Walt Brown's theory has the elements coming out, and as they come out, they're cooling down and they're forming the radioactive elements. So as they become radioactive elements, they deposit farther away because they just formed, and then as you get closer, they date younger, because that is how they were released. Remember, radioactive elements come from super heavy elements, and since Walt Brown model has them forming during the flood, it's about distribution from coming out of the supercritical water, essentially. So basically, the continent's so heavy, it dropped down, crushed water underneath the continent so much that the quartz crystal inside the granite rock created a piezoelectric effect through a process called Z-pinch, and created super heavy elements that are now in the water. And the water ejected out and started covering the world. And as these super heavy elements are cooling down, they're forming in uranium and thorium and potassium. And as they're forming, they're settling down based on their weight. And now the continents rise up. And so all of these new radioactive elements are on the continents. And then the closer you get to the ridge, they're forming at a later time. So therefore, they look younger. Now, if we go with the catastrophic plate tectonics, the answer would be different, because those were already there. So what would happen? Well, from their perspective, water has, it would be like a garden hose, pushing water out of it. So you're pushing the elements away from the mid-Atlantic ridge. That's why when you get near the mid-Atlantic ridge, you don't find it's just like a massive multi-mile high ridge that jettisons straight up and then falls back down, and things are away from it. But you notice how there's like almost nothing near it at all. It's because the water pressure was so high that it would have washed everything away from it. So it's washing elements, radioactive elements as well, away from it. So it's pushing radioactive elements away. So the more it pushes elements away, the heavier they are, the deeper they go and the farther they get away. So therefore, again, testing it from their model would also give the same results. It's the evolutionary model that has the biggest problem, because theirs is not water ever coming out of there. It's only lava. And the deep lava is coming out with uranium in it from the core. And since it's the oldest uranium on Earth, it's now coming to the surface and it's bubbling over very slowly. And therefore, the oldest uranium should be at the mid-Atlantic ridge, not farther away from it. So it's the exact opposite of what we find. So by us having the radioactive elements formed at creation, which would be catastrophic plates, I like a little bit more, because then we don't have to resort to Z-pinch nor accelerated nuclear decay, because all of these things were made through the same process at creation. There's no need for anything, because that's what I mean. Literally, it kind of describes it actually in Genesis 1. I mean, God's moving across the waters. He says, let there be light. That's sonoluminescence. And then all of a sudden there's dry land appearing. Well, these are elements, right? And there's no life to be harmed if these are the radioactive elements forming at this time. Plus the floodwaters. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'll wait till you're done, brother.
I think the floodwaters actually do help us to explain the radioactive element distribution that we see today. And it makes a lot more sense than the secular explanation, unless they want to invoke that there is no nuclear reaction going on from uranium in the crust. And there are those models. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that all of them believe that uranium is down there. No, we still don't know about Earth's core. No one's been there. The deepest hole that's ever been dug, what did we find? We found water. We didn't find it. But what happened is we did get higher temperature. So therefore, higher temperature probably means there's more thermal energy, which comes from radiation. Therefore, there must be some kind of radioactive material. Therefore, there must be uranium, since it's heavier and it's deeper. So that's where that comes from. So now the heat from the rapid plate movement. Everybody wants numbers. I don't blame them.
Actually, let me say one thing, brother, before you move to that, because your answer there was spot on, was epic, brother. Very detailed. I appreciate that. And I want to point out to the audience too, based on, especially anybody new, we spent a lot of time earlier, at least on radiocarbon dating, and the fact that it's a Young Earth Creationist best friend, really, and it just on its own dismantles old Earth creationism and obviously just complete naturalism. So definitely check that out. But even when it comes to your other dating methods, right, potassium, argon, uranium to lead, the fact that we have so many discrepancies points us to the fact that what we are looking at best are relative ages and not absolute, right? And that's what these critics need to understand, because we still do get the same or similar relative ages in the, let's say, the rocks that are at the bottom of the geological column, right? We'll typically see a lot of those rocks give older ages for the most part than rocks on the top. Of course, there's always outliers, okay? But this is exactly what we'd expect based on the Genesis flood model. Matt, as you're pointing out, we like to start from the Genesis flood model. That's where we can make the best testable predictions. We spent a great deal of time going over the massive slabs of cold rock found where they should have either melted or warmed up to the surrounding material. There was actually a confirmed prediction from a Young Earth creationist. At best, our uniformitarians can try and force fit the data into their model, but they did not predict it, and it is essentially contradictory to their model. But the fact is, this is what we would expect to find based on the Genesis flood model, in that rocks laid down early in the flood should give older ages than the rocks at the top at the end of the flood, right? So the dates derived from all of these dating methods would then be, as we're pointing out, relative and not absolute. And that's actually the best explanation for the massive discrepancy in dates, okay, that we get even from rocks of known age, where we get inaccurate dates from rocks of unknown age. Therefore, why should we trust dates derived from rocks of unknown age? Doesn't make any sense. Well, it's because what we're looking at is at best relative ages and not absolute, brother. Anyways, yeah, go ahead. And if you had any thoughts on that, and then I'm sorry to interrupt, go to your next part, brother.
Oh yeah, no problem. I mean, I'm almost done anyway. I just wanted to reiterate, or not even reiterate one thing. I just wanted to make a closing, and then I wanted to give everybody a video, if you want me to play it anyway. It's about 10 minutes, and it gives the math from the perspective of where would the heat go, what's going on, how much would be generated from the movements of plates moving very quickly away from each other. We're not talking about hydroplate theory, where there's all these other elements involved. We're talking about rapid plate movement. Now remember, critics of the fast-moving plates should realize that catastrophism was removed by evolutionary scientists a long time ago because it's not uniformitarianism. That Lyle hated the biblical young Earth creation ideas. He hated he did all of it. Matter of fact, he even said his goal was to remove Moses from the sciences. So being a lawyer, he thought of an idea to just create the geologic column and just get rid of everything. So he said, I need to wipe out the idea that anybody can even look at catastrophism. So now it's hindered and considered pseudoscience. They don't look at it. They don't deem it. They don't. So even if they were to see evidence for it, they're not allowed to really do much with it. So keep that in mind. There's a lot of bias when it comes to these different things. And when you're looking at something and you've got a government grant, you're not going to be like, wow, why is this gigantic rock here? Well, I mean, there's the only way it could be here was because of a flood, but a flood didn't happen. So maybe it happened during an ice age when a giant thing of rock brought it down and dropped it there. But it definitely wasn't during a flood. It was just during an ice age that almost entirely covered the world. It's like, wait a minute, that's exactly what we're saying happened. But anyway, we got to be really cautious when we get into these things that say, well, the geologists that are currently working in the field, they don't see a global flood. Yeah, no kidding. You think a person that's never been trained or never supposed to look for it is going to find evidence for something that they can't see? It just doesn't even make sense. It's like, anyway. I couldn't. Go ahead.
The other thing, Matt, it seems from my perspective, where I read a lot of secular papers and articles, and every bit of information new information that's collected seems to support our narrative rather than theirs. I read one just this morning, actually. It was written in 2017, so it's fairly recent. It's a newscience.com article. The title of it says, "There's as much water in Earth's mantle as in all the oceans." And it says, if our estimation is correct, it means there is a large amount of water in the deep Earth, says Hong Zhan Fei at the University of Beirut, Germany. My dog's going crazy.
Yeah.
So as I said, bits of information like the blobs, the water in the mantle, the carbon-14, the flocculation of limestone, all these sorts of bits and pieces are coming together. I think it was a couple of weeks ago, Professor McQueen mentioned the jigsaw puzzle. And it's all these bits of pieces of information are coming together now, and we're starting to form a picture. There's still a lot of missing pieces, but we're starting to form a picture.
Right. Yeah, that's the cool thing, because we don't deny that there's a heat problem really in any model, because think about it. Something had to kill the aquatic life. You're not going to have, I mean, what else would do it? I mean, we know that the land life was wiped out, and you're not going to get a tsunami to kill all the aquatic life. But we know there was a genetic bottleneck in all the aquatic life, just as it was on land life. So what would do that? Well, the heat actually answers that problem for us.
Right.
It's actually really good evidence for us, because I didn't know how a global flood would kill fish. They live in water. It's like saying wind killed all of the living creatures on land. It's like, well, we breathe air. I don't know why heavy wind would kill us all, but okay. But so
it's just funny because I'm sorry, Matt. Go ahead.
No, I was just basically kind of saying there's got to be some type of a process to kill all the aquatic life, and heat answers that for us now.
Exactly. The heat and energy released at the flood actually answers so many so-called problems or objections that the old Earth creationists or the atheists would put forth against the global flood. But no, heat and energy, as radiocarbon is a friend of the young Earth creationists. If anything, plants, which we know, Matt, as you if you wanted to cover a little bit too, we know the pre-flood world was 90% green, with massive plant fauna existing that we don't see today. And the fact that even the secularists would agree that crude oil, coal, and gas are fossil fuels. They were formed over millions of years, right? There's their assumption, from the remains of dead organisms. Oh, how funny. Answer me, George and Matt. What would result on an Earth with that's filled with life for the most part in a global flood? Well, we'd have a lot of dead organisms, right? Also, coal was formed from dead trees and other plant material. Matt, can you give the audience an idea just to how green and how different the pre-flood world really was?
If you go to the most tropical jungle that you possibly can today, it would come nowhere close to even a square mile of the antediluvian world, because what happens is when you're looking at plants today, we're seeing a stunted miniature version of everything, because when they're placed in hyperbaric biodome chambers or oxygen chambers, or they're even played, for example, just a frequency like sonic bloom, you can get corn to go 3 times the height just with the frequency. Now imagine if that same corn was also grown in a hyperbaric chamber. We know that the atmospheric conditions were double of what they are today. So if you go back and you double atmospheric everything, there's a reason a sloth that's 25 pounds weighed 7,000 back then. So if it's doing that to animals, it's clearly doing that with plants, which breathe an entirely different way through their leaves underneath the stomata. So we can replicate somewhat of that world back then, and every individual thing we do causes massive proliferation of that plant to grow huge. So imagine all of those things together. We can't even fathom how insane it must have been to see a world so massively enriched with plants like that. I mean, imagine we find pine cones this big, huge. We find figs. Imagine eating one fig and being full. We found massive petrified figs that big. Figs are, That's insane. We found gigantic versions of everything. We found a bell pepper like the size of a bowling ball. Incredible.
That would feed us for a year, brother.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing, Matt, we're now realizing with the additional CO2 in the atmosphere, the world is becoming greener. I mean, farmers are even pumping CO2 into their glass houses to actually speed up the growth of tomatoes and those sorts of fruits. So, yeah, there's a lot of things that were different in the past that we probably not privy to know until we do the investigations and find out further evidence.
Well, remember, that's one of the things that the scoffers are going to deny, the fact that things were different in the past. Things were different in the pre-flood world. That's also the problem that the old earth creationists have when they want to use or adopt the same arguments that the atheists are putting forth. It's actually going to show their position to be inconsistent, because now they're using arguments derived from the atheist who denies miracles, denies the Bible, denies the history as laid out in the Bible. The fact that we're dealing with a world that then was being overflowed with water perished. That's a previous world that existed that perished. And this world that we're currently in, okay, in terms of the post-flood world, is completely different. And I wanted to read this real quick. If you notice this, this article, How Do Coal and Oil Form? Over time, the increased pressures and heat resulting from the overlying rock transformed the decomposed matter to coal and oil. Point is this pre-flood world would have been, and we've said it before, the perfect battery for so many reasons to absorb and utilize a lot of this heat and energy to get the plates moving, to rapidly produce, oil, coal, and gas from that pre-flood world that was essentially so much more green and different, as Matt was pointing out. And on top of that, everything we've been discussing for the first 2 hours in regards to the mantle and other mechanisms to take up a lot of the heat, all these different heat sinks. Go ahead, George. I'm sorry. I heard you're going to say something.
That's all right. I was just going to add to what you're saying. I recall when I was in uni in the early 70s, and I recall back then they were saying in terms of the oil, we only had like 25, 30 years of oil left. But then they kept finding more oil. And and believe me, as we did in the oil exploration, they keep revising that figure. So some of those numbers that I gave you, the quantities of the coal and the oil, they're probably just guesses, and it's probably double that, maybe even triple that. They don't know, because they keep finding more and more resources of these elements, and which they probably didn't know 10, 20 years ago.
George, have you heard the old earth creationists? I know Dr. Kenny Rhodes used this argument in Dr. Ken Hovind's debate 2 weeks ago, which was a fantastic debate. Two amazing must-watch debates 2 weeks in a row. Looks like we're going to have Kent back on next month for 2 more debates as well. One on local or global flood, what does the Bible teach? And another one on Noah's Ark and Noah's flood, fact or fiction. That'll be with an atheist, and an end times debate. So that being said, lots to look forward to. But George, you may remember, and you too, Matt, Dr. Rhodes, who we love, he's a brother in Christ. We just believe he's wrong on the age of the earth and the local flood idea. But he was putting forth this idea that there's too much oil, coal, natural gas, for example, to be explained in a worldwide flood. But isn't that funny that there's too much? But yet when we consider the pre-flood world and this incredible relationship that we know to be true between heat, pressure, and the formation of that which the old earth creationists say we can't explain because there's so much, that means there's so much that we have for absorption purposes in this pre-flood world. What are your thoughts on that, gentlemen?
Foot in mouth disease.
You shoot yourself in the foot with these arguments, right? It's
I think I read an article
or not. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I read an article in CMI or ICR, I can't remember now, about that particular issue, but I can't remember the details. I can find it, and but they answer that objection.
Well, I'm saying it's not. No, I'm saying it's obviously it's not a problem because of the relationship that we now know exists between heat, pressure, and the rapid formation of coal and oil. The point is, no, there is more than enough plant material and dead organisms and whatnot in the pre-flood world to explain the massive distribution of coal and oil and things like this, because even they admit there would have been a massive amount of heat produced during the flood, and therefore that heat can be utilized to what? Produce and form all of this material that the old Earth creationists say we have no way to explain. No, we do, obviously, and heat is utilized for that. Yeah, go ahead, brother.
Well, remember, I think a few weeks ago we spoke about the limestone, and I think there were some scientists in Sweden where they were trying to solve this climate change issue, and they were pumping the CO2 deep down into the earth at high temperatures, and they to their surprise, they found that CO2 actually turned into limestone, I think about 6 to 12 months later. And I think even today I mentioned a particular paper or an article which I read that suggested there's shed loads of CO2 in the mantle. Shed loads. So when they talk about, how could all this limestone form? Well, look, that's empirical evidence. They've pumped CO2 into the substrata down there at high temperatures, and it turned to limestone. What more do you need?
Well, sometimes it's just not good enough for the critics. Yeah, go ahead, Matt. Thoughts or?
I would say that if the evolutionists believe that there were enough dinosaurs alive at one time to fart themselves into extinction from methane in great global temperature, there should be enough life forms to get buried in the global flood to create enough oil and gas too.
Right.
Even if there was no living creatures at all, we still have plants which are biological, and they would also form. So with a whole world completely full of basically greenhouse effects of causing massive plants. And another thing is when they find oil wells, and these oil wells go down for the oil and they pump it out, they think they eventually got it all. All this oil right here gets sucked up. So they think that it's gone. And what happens is, because the oil is so viscous, it takes a long time for it to flow back down into that region where it can get sucked back up again. So what happens is they turn their machines off, and they didn't realize it. And they turned them back on like a decade later, and it was full of oil again. So what happened is, it's not like water where it just flows back in and you can constantly pump it up. It's so viscous and slow leaching that the oil's still there. It's just in a different area, and it slowly leaches back down in the area where it can be sucked back up to the surface again. So there's a lot of oil down there still. We can't even... Chechnya has like the second biggest oil reserve on Earth. That's why they're so comfortable talking a lot of trash and not worrying about going to war, because they've got all the oil they need for a long time over there.
Man, that's a great point, brother. That is a great point. Before we get to this video, I think we're going to probably start wrapping it up. I imagine you guys are probably getting tired too, going on the 3-hour mark. And this has just been nonstop information. For example, we've got Honesty Angel in the chat that says, just haven't been in the chat much, been listening. Yes, I understand, guys. A lot of technical information. I mean, we've had 4 separate presentations today, including answering some objections, some questions, and arguments put forth by the critics. So definitely, anybody who's just getting here, make sure to start from the beginning and check it out to get the full context. George, before we get into Matt here, what his final part of the presentation, can you then sum up in a nutshell, I guess, what we're saying in terms of all of these different mechanisms when it comes to heat contributing to the mass, the rapid formation that we've seen in laboratory experiments of coal, oil, natural gas, hypercanes, a mile or more of water that would help absorb a lot of the heat, as well as the radiation act as a nuclear reactor, shielding Noah and the animals, including these supersonic steam jets taking a lot of the heat up into space, and all the other things that we've covered. But also why? Because we've seen people like Jordan, nuclear engineer, who says he's calculated all these things, and it's really only 1% or 0.5% of the amount of heat that needs to be taken up or absorbed. But that's where the bulk of this presentation comes into play in regards to the blobs and the mantle. Can you explain in a nutshell, as we wrap it up, why that takes care of the rest of the heat? Go ahead, brother.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, my discussion with John McKay yesterday, let's not forget, ours is a hypothesis, but so is theirs. I've presented two models where the heat could have, and I say could have, been absorbed by the mantle, or it could have been absorbed by the blobs. And what we see today are just remnants of those bigger blobs that might have been in place back 4,500 years. And that's consistent with the cold plate subduction, the fact that the blobs haven't reached equilibrium with the surrounding mantle temperatures, the cold plate subduction not being at equilibrium as well. And I think it was mentioned that these things travel at, fingernail growth rate. That's pretty. So you'd think none of this evidence should be available if it's if the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. And so some of the stories, if I'll call them stories, that I've read about how they solve, why don't all the super heavy elements, why haven't they sunk down deep into the core like the iron and the nickel, and how we got the super heavy elements on the surface. It's really laughable. It's a just so story. So I mean, if you take that as fact, then let's throw our hands up and say, okay, you're right. But they're not. It's just a story. They can't prove it. There's no proof there that happened.
In other words,
yeah.
No, go ahead, brother. I'm sorry.
I don't know what more I can say. I mean, we as I said, we can present more problems to them that they need to answer, that we need to answer to them. As I said, the issue with water being deposited on Earth by water comets. I mean, you do the calculations on the amount of energy that these comets would have emitted slamming into the Earth. As I said earlier, I think it's about 340 times greater than the energy or the heat that Jordan had calculated. And that is confirmed by an article I read from CMI about the these are their scenarios, not ours, and we're just going by their scenarios and say, okay, well, based on your scenario, if so many comets hit the Earth and they emit so much energy with each impact, you're going to have a lot of heat emitted there. So we have to point the finger at them and ask for plausible explanations from them, not just the other way around. And I'll reiterate again, it's not a solution that can be solved by one scientific discipline. It's a multidisciplinary solution. You need to involve climatologists, meteorologists, physics, chemistry, geologists, geophysics. A number of fields have to come together to answer this problem. It's not going to be done just by geophysicists.
Amen. Well said, brother. Well said. Here, this is why there are so many for these critics, okay, who want to, especially the old Earth creationists, who want to put forth this local flood, just nonsense idea, really. They have so many problems to address and challenges that we've put forth, and we have. I have compiled playlist after playlist with our number of lectures with professional geologists, professional flood researchers. We've had Michael J. Ord on numerous times. We just had him on recently debunking, so-called evolutionary challenges to the global flood model. They don't answer the challenges. They ignore the objections. They don't make their own testable predictions. At this point, if they still want to put forth this heat problem as an unsolvable issue. They have a lot of work to do in terms of answering the problems that preclude their model or their theory or their worldview that the Earth and the universe are billions of years old and there never was a worldwide flood. So obviously we're not going to hold our breath on that one. You know, it's typically just the same talking points put forth over and over and over and over again. So that being said, they have a lot to deal with that they have not yet dealt with and will probably not yet deal with. So anyways, yeah, go ahead.
Standing, it's a bit, I think you mentioned this, I can't remember, maybe it wasn't you, but somebody said whenever I'm looking to solve a problem, I open up the Bible and there it is right in front of me, the clause. It just answers my problem. My eureka moment came from I think it was a month or so ago when we interviewed Dr. Jason Lyle.
Yes.
And he mentioned, can anyone tell us what the temperature of the Mantle was 4,500 years ago? And like a light bulb went up in my head. And I thought, I wonder if anyone's actually looked at that. And then I started to do a bit of research. Hello. I looked at the blobs, and the blobs are located in the Mantle. And I thought, hey, hold on. What if the heat actually went in the other direction? Or maybe both directions, but most of it would have gone down into the Mantle and the blobs. And then this is the challenge I want to put forward to any PhDs, scientists of the big three, the CMI, the OOG, the ICR. If you're listening, please devote some resources and look at that hypothesis and see whether it's actually a plausible hypothesis.
Absolutely.
And whether it can work.
Amen. Well said, brother. Yeah, well said. I love it. So let's hand it over to Matt.
Okay. I will be screen sharing, so let me know. I'll get the audio down and I'll just be quiet because I have to share I can't upload it. It's more than 10 minutes. So I'm just going to have to share screen and be quiet during the whole time.
Okay.
Everyone enjoys.
I'll mute myself.
Okay.
Is this a video that we'll have to talk a little bit through just to avoid any copyright issues, or is it a video we can just play?
Yeah, it's already on. It'll be fine. It's just pure math for the people that really want the numbers. So no big deal.
Actually, I want to point this out. I know Redefine Living says Dr. Lyle upload. So for anyone in the chat who hasn't seen, me, Matt, and George, we had Dr. Jason Lyle on, a few months ago. And we did a lot of prep. We even challenged the atheists to email us their best objections. So we compiled the best objections possible, especially to distant starlight. And we had Dr. Jason Lyle on here. It's racked up, a couple thousand views. Definitely check that out. And we put Dr. Lyle to work, and he was awesome. I mean, he demolished all the objections we put forth to him, including objections on distant starlight. That interview goes untouched. That interview goes, it hasn't been refuted. And Dr. Lyle's distant starlight model really has been a massive game changer, and the critics can't deal with it. Dr. Lyle recently debated Hugh Ross. And I'm talking about recently, like within the last year. It was more of a discussion, actually. And Dr. Lyle really, really cornered Dr. Ross on distant starlight. And I highly recommend that as well. So point is, as we always say on this channel, and I think we're going to get a new shirt on that. We're going to, it's called, "It's a Great Time to Be a Young Earth Creationist," because the science is on our side. Our side are the ones that are making the testable predictions. And it's the non-Young Earth Creationists, if you notice, when it comes to scripture and science, they spend a lot of time on the defense. And I find that to be rather revealing. So that being said, I just wanted to point that out. Matt, yeah, if you wanted to screen share, brother, we'll play your video.
All right, here we go. Please ignore my desktop. It's a mess.
It's a busy desktop, brother.
Yeah.
But you're a walking genius, so of course you're going to have that much information.
All right, everyone, here we go. Let me make sure the whole, that's good enough. All right, turn it up.
There are many flood models available, but they all have one problem in common. They have too much heat involved. And take a look at the statement A sudden exposure of the mantle to 70% of the Earth's surface would release enough heat energy to boil the oceans dry several times. This is comparable to the statement, your oven has enough energy to set your curtains on fire. They are not on fire, so you don't have an oven. For comparison, the Tsar Bomba released more energy than all weapons and bombs in all wars combined, yet nobody got killed. So two things are important. It's not only the amount of energy that is involved that matters, but also the heat transport. In other words, where is the heat? So heat transport then. How do we get heat from here to there? Basically, there are only three ways to do that: heat flow, conduction, and thermal radiation. If none of these is available, the heat stays where it is. Flow is like this. You have a liquid or a gas that is hot and a material moves. So this is flow and this is no flow. Conduction. Conduction is heat transport by material that is touching each other. So consider we have a hot material touching a cold material in a closed environment and the material doesn't move. After a while, all this material will have a medium temperature. So this is a good conductor and this is a bad conductor. Radiation. Radiation is heat transport by emitting light. If it's very hot, it can be red, yellow, or even white. But usually we don't see it because the majority is infrared light. So this is a good radiator and this is a bad radiator. So technically it's possible to trap heat, like heat, inside the Earth. Let's take a random example. Assume we have a large piece of rock and suddenly parts of this rock gets molten for some reason. It expands a little, and now let's add water to it. And let's assume the rock contains enough heat to boil all this water away. So the water then starts to boil at some point, and the lava is starting to cool down. The lava sinks slowly, causing some places where hot rock goes upward. And after a while, a solid layer forms on top of this molten rock, and then eventually we would have a situation where a solid layer isolates the hot molten rock from the water. So we'd end up with trapped heat and still a lot of water on top. So for all the oceans to evaporate, all heat must end up in the ocean, which does not happen. You see, it's possible to touch freshly solidified lava with your shoes shortly without them catching fire. For your own safety, I highly recommend not to do this, but it is possible. So let's take a look at what would happen if continents shift quickly, exposing hot mantle material. Say the left is South America, the middle part is lava, but this is what is going to be the Atlantic Ocean, and the right is Africa. The lava is lighter than the solid rock, so it expands. Not only does this boil the ocean away there, but it also pushes the ocean away there because of the expansion. The result is that it would start to rain like crazy in colder areas, and that is on the continents. So we would have a situation where the ocean is flooding the continents, and the lava has a lot of freedom to expose its heat to the sky and the universe. At the edge of the continents, the water touches the hot lava, enhancing the solidification process there. Because it solidifies, it shrinks and becomes denser than the continents, so it leaves more room for the water there. The molten lava is being squeezed out horizontally and wants to flow on top of the solidified lava. But there's water there, so it also starts to solidify. So the water is slowly pushing the molten lava towards the middle, and eventually two layers of solidified lava lean on each other, and this causes a closing seam, closing midpoint, which we identify today as a mid-oceanic ridge. When it comes to thermal radiation, we can actually calculate how long this would take. For that, we need to use the Stefan-Boltzmann law. And the result of this formula is energy per time. You get it by multiplying some constant value with the emissivity, the area, and the temperature. But the temperature is in the fourth power in this formula, resulting in a tremendous nonlinear process. So the answer is in watts or joules per second, and Stefan's constant is a very small number. The emissivity is a property of the material. We're going to calculate this for basalt, which is what the oceanic floor is made of. The area is in square meters and the temperature is in kelvins. Let's give an example first. If we would have 1 cubic meter of basalt being exposed for only 1 square meter, how long would it take to solidify? And like I said, it strongly depends on the temperature. If it would cool down from 2000 Kelvin to 1900 Kelvin, it would take 399 seconds, which is about 7 minutes. From 1000 to 900 Kelvin, it takes about 2 hours. From 300 to 200 Kelvins, it takes about 20 days. And from 100 to 0 takes forever. It will never reach 0. And so this is very strongly nonlinear. Now assume we have 2 blocks of rock. They are made of the same material, they are equally thick, and they are only exposed at the top. But one of these blocks is a lot larger than the other. Which would cool down faster? If we use both the formula for heat capacity and the Stephen-Boltzmann law, we see that the area plays a role in both. More area means more heat capacity in a linear way, but more area means more thermal radiation also in a linear way. This means that in the end, for the cooling down time, area isn't relevant, it's the thickness that matters. So we can make the formulas a little bit simpler. And now we can calculate the thermal radiation for a scenario. What if the entire oceanic crust was molten at the same time? How long would it take to solidify? We use these variables. The thickness of the oceanic crust is about 7 kilometers on average, and we use temperatures that are normal for molten lava, which is a starting temperature of 1600 degrees Celsius and a solidification temperature of 1000 degrees Celsius. For this calculation, it is better to integrate the Stephen-Boltzmann law to get accurate results. Since the temperature is so high, the energy emission is huge. Remember, the temperature is in the 4th power. It takes 1 year and 150 days to solidify. So not billions of years, not millions of years, not even thousands of years, only 1.5 years, because the solidifying process itself also releases energy. This is called latent heat fusion. But also this takes only 2.3 years. So if we would melt the entire oceanic crust at once, it takes only 3.7 years to solidify using thermal radiation alone. Water enhances this solidification process, so we are actually very much in the right order of magnitude for the Genesis flood. If you see my other presentation about the solar system, you see that the evolutionary timescale for things like the moon are very far off. When a crust is solidified, it's still quite hot, about 1000 degrees Celsius. Then conduction takes over for the cooling down process. We can also calculate this. We have a formula that says that heat conduction per time is the thermal conductivity times the area times the temperature difference on both sides of the material divided by the thickness of the layer. To do this properly, we must divide the materials up in smaller layers because each of these layers have their own temperature, and thus they have their own amount of heat energy and their own conduction speed. All these layers give their energy to their neighbors, and only the top layers releases that energy to cool the whole lot down. So we start with a lot of layers that are 1000 degrees Celsius each, except for the top layer, which is a room temperature. Remember, there's water on top, which consumes a lot of heat. The layers are 50 meters thick each, and we're using a time interval of about 100 days to calculate the conductivity step by step. And we represent the temperature with colors. Red is 1000 degrees Celsius, yellow is 500, and green is 20. Here we display a layer of 7 kilometers thick. This is what it looks like after 90 years, 1000 years, 2000 years, 3000 years, 4000 years, and let's stop at 4500 years. If we are looking at the Genesis flood, it could be that this is close to the time that has passed since. There are uncertainties of when the flood year was, which is a subject for another discussion, but let's just see what the result is after 4500 years. In this scenario, all would have cooled down, and we would find the maximum of 590 degrees Celsius at 4,700 meters depth. Remember, we still have a lot of volcanic areas, which are in the basaltic oceanic crust, so conductivity is happening there. Since these are still hot today and only a few kilometers depth, It means these volcanic areas could not be millions of years old. This calculation shows that it can only stay hot for thousands of years. Now, when it comes to heat, there are some pretty weird phenomena that come into play. One is a thermocline. You may wonder how fish could survive such a scenario. Let's say we have regions with hot water and regions with cold water. Then there are also places where the hot water flows on top of the cold water. The hot water kills the fishes. Yes, we find a lot of dead fish in the geologic layers. And the fishes in the cold water can survive. The hot water is less dense than the cold water. This causes that hot and cold water don't mix very well. This causes a separation between hot and cold water layers, and this separation is called a thermocline. Important for fishes, but you don't need that information for the rest of this presentation. Now, the next issue is power law creep. Power law creep is a process that causes rock to become viscous without increase in temperature. How do you do that? Well, let's assume we have several layers of rock, we put pressure on it, and we are going to push the top layer sideways. That is called shear stress. Then the middle layer will start to deform. In other words, it changes shape. Now, if we put a gigantic shear stress on the top layer, the layer below dramatically changes shape. This process is very strongly nonlinear and has to do with molecular structures breaking up and crystalline surfaces sliding on top of each other. It's very complex, but it has been tested in the laboratory. You can compare this with toothpaste. Toothpaste is solid until you put pressure on it, then it changes shape, but it will become solid again as soon as the pressure stops. This process reduces the viscosity of the rock up to 14 orders of magnitude, and thus it's very strongly nonlinear. In very extreme conditions, solid rock can flow like water without increase in temperature. The last weird phenomenon I'm going to show you is the crossover depth. We are used to magma rising up because molten material has a lower density than the same material in solid state. But it appears that molten rock is better compressible than solid rock. So if you put a lot of pressure on lava, it will eventually become more dense than the solid rock. So magma that is very deep inside the earth sinks. The point where this switches from rising to sinking is called the crossover depth. Depending on the rock type, the point where this happens is between 200 and 400 kilometers. This phenomenon has also been confirmed by multiple laboratory experiments. And very importantly, it shows that magma cannot come from deeper than 400 kilometers. The crossover depth is about here. What I think that happened is that large impact plus the crossover depth plus power law creep is catastrophic plate tectonics.
There we have it.
All right, great video. Before we start wrapping it up, some thoughts on that, George, Matt?
That was excellent.
Yeah.
Science and maths.
Yeah, showing it from our perspective. So it's exactly what the critic wants. They want the numbers. They want to know the math. They want to know what are the circumstances, even in the worst case scenario for heating. And he answered it in forms of even if it melted the entire continental crust, how much heat would be generated. So you have the numbers given from every possible scenario with catastrophic plate tectonics. So there you have it.
Amen. Amen. And what I like about that is it kind of completed the 3-hour rebuttal. Some people in the chat were saying, a 3-hour response. Yes. We don't play any games here on, Team Standing for Truth. Our last rebuttal to Joel Duff and good old Rob from Sentinel Apologetics was about 4 hours. So, and it's always 3 or 4 hours of information, as you can see. So we're going to start wrapping it up here. Anybody who recently joined us, we had roughly 4 presentations during this show. So definitely start from the beginning. We had a presentation from myself, conclusively showing that the Bible indeed does teach a worldwide flood, something the Old Earth Creationists are going to have to deal with somehow. Presentation from Professor David McQueen. Definitely check that out. A presentation from George and a presentation from Matt, and all ending with that awesome 10-minute video. So that being said, gentlemen, any final words before we shut it down?
Yeah, I had 3 hours of sleep. I've had one toast for breakfast with avocado and goat cheese, and I need a pizza and a nap.
Listen, you earned it. You earned it, George. You earned it, George. I've really only had coffee today, so I'm about to go pig out. Hopefully, the wife made me something nice. Matt, final words, Mr. Devolution.
No, just hope that everybody liked it, and hope that I explained everything good when it was my turn. Hopefully, everything was understandable. Tried to get some visuals in there, and it's kind of like we really wanted to put it to rest this time. You know, the heat problem keeps coming up. It's like their last ditch effort to prove that the flood didn't happen. They want to ignore the genetics. They want to ignore the other physical evidence. So they're basically like, well, it couldn't have happened because of this one scenario. So that's all they've got left. So I hope that they.
Sorry, Matt, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, they're critics for a reason, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
It's for the audience. It's for the open-minded people, not the because remember, when we had Dr. Frank Turek on last week, he pointed out the fact that there's two types of skeptics. The skeptics that are actually looking for answers, when they get the answers, they admit, okay, you know, thanks so much. That's an answer to my question. Or the skeptics that aren't really looking for answers, they're just active fighters of Christianity, Young Earth Creation, the Bible, so on and so forth. So we also presented a multitude of challenges to the critics as well, if they ever feel like they need damage control, which is usually what results is damage control. But we'll make another prediction. So we have confirmed prediction after confirmed prediction. Another prediction is the challenges will go unaddressed as usual. So that being said, everybody in the chat, we're going to see you tomorrow for John McKay, the creation guy. Start thinking up your questions now. We're going to have a ton of fun with him. Then the following day, we've got Dr. Joseph Kazil back here with us for a technical presentation on what is junk DNA. The same night, we've got a debate between Praise I Am and Stacy. And remember, the Human Evolution Handbook, start looking out for that, hopefully within the next month.
I think Steph Harima is somewhere in there, isn't he?
That's right, brother. And then on Thursday, we've got Steph Harima. We're going to be debunking Dr. Henke, I think his name is.
That's it, yeah.
Yes.
And the Castile Formation.
Yes. So I'm excited for that. In other words, guys, we've got a show literally nearly every single day this week, including 2 shows, it looks like, on Wednesday. So we're going to be busy, and that's why we wanted to kind of put this one to bed. So that being said, Pigs Can Fly, thanks so much. Brother, thank you so much. Honesty Angel, everybody in the chat. Great chat tonight. Tons of fun. Thanks so much for the support. And 3 hours really has flown by. So, George, you've earned yourself some pizza. Standing for Truth, George Bond, Mattman, Professor David McQueen, we are out.